My name is Samantha. I am 34 years old, and today, in this single quiet moment, I hold the fate of my entire family in the palm of my hand. Exactly 7 years ago, I stood by the front door in my only cheap suit, begging my mother to let me leave for the final interview that could change my life forever. Instead of wishing me luck, she planted herself squarely in the exit and told me my only real purpose in this world was to babysit my sister's children so she could go enjoy a luxury brunch without a single care. My father laughed without even glancing up and said, "Girls like you do not get lives, we only get duties." When my sister dropped her heavy diaper bag at my feet and told me, almost bored, not to ruin her weekend, I made a choice in that instant that severed my family ties forever. I stepped over the bag, walked out the back door, and vanished from their lives completely. They thought I was a failure, a disappointment who would eventually crawl back begging for scraps of their approval. What they did not know was that 7 years later, they would be sitting in a corporate boardroom, begging a ruthless senior partner to save them from federal prison and total bankruptcy, completely unaware that the executive holding the power to destroy them was the exact same daughter they had thrown away like garbage. Before I tell you exactly how I systematically dismantled their fraudulent little empire without them ever realizing it, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to build your own empire from nothing just to crush the people who tried so hard to keep you at the bottom. The rain poured down mercilessly on the morning of my final interview. I had spent the entire previous day preparing for a meeting at one of the top mergers and acquisitions firms in New York City. I had starved myself just to afford the bus ticket, living off nothing but instant noodles out of sheer spite and stubborn determination. Both of my hands were trembling as I adjusted the collar of my discount store blazer. It did not fit right at all, but it was the very best I could manage on my budget. I took a slow, deep breath, clutching my portfolio tightly against my chest, and walked down the narrow hallway toward the front door. My mother, Brenda, stood directly in front of the exit, blocking it entirely. Her arms were crossed tightly over her silk morning robe, and she looked at me with a deep, simmering annoyance that had become painfully familiar. "Where exactly do you think you are going?" she demanded. "I have my final interview today, Mom," I said, forcing my tone to stay calm and level. "I told you weeks ago, this job could get me out of debt for good." Brenda did not move an inch. "Your sister has brunch with the country club wives this morning," she stated flatly, as though that settled everything. "You are watching her kids." My stomach dropped straight through the floor. "Mom, I cannot. If I miss this, I lose the opportunity completely. This is my only ticket out. I have worked for months just to get here." My father, Thomas, chuckled quietly from his leather recliner. He did not even bother looking up from his tablet screen. "Girls like you do not get lives, Samantha," he said with casual, offhand cruelty, as if commenting on the weather. "You get duties. Ashley is married to a chief financial officer. She has an image to maintain. She cannot be seen dragging toddlers around to brunch." The injustice of it burned hot in my throat. Well, I spent 4 straight years working night jobs cleaning offices just to pay for my finance degree. Meanwhile, my parents drained their entire savings account for Ashley's destination wedding. Ashley had married Devin, an African-American financial executive whose flashy suits and confident swagger had immediately won my parents over. Devin walked around our childhood house like he already owned the deed to it, constantly bragging about his supposed offshore investments and business connections. My parents worshipped him completely because he provided the affluent, polished image they had always craved for the family. They gave Ashley everything she ever wanted, and then quietly demanded that I hand over the rest of myself too. "Dad, please," I begged, feeling hot tears sting the corners of my eyes. "I will babysit every single weekend next month, I promise. I just need 4 hours today. This job pays enough for me to finally move out and stop being such a burden on everyone. You are a burden because you choose to be difficult, Brenda snapped, still blocking the doorknob with her whole body. You are incredibly selfish, Samantha. Your sister is trying to build a network for her husband. Devin works extremely hard to provide for his family, and Ashley needs to support him in that. The very least you can do is watch your own niece and nephew for a few short hours. The front door suddenly swung open, pushing Brenda slightly off balance. Ashley walked in holding a massive designer coffee cup, completely oblivious to the rising tension around her. She looked perfectly polished, wearing a soft cashmere sweater and pristine white trousers without a single wrinkle. Behind her, two toddlers were already sprinting toward the living room, shrieking loudly with excitement. Ashley did not even glance at my face. She simply dropped a heavy, overstuffed diaper bag directly onto my scuffed, worn-out shoes. "Make sure the bottles are warm this time," Ashley said, examining her freshly manicured nails as though nothing else in the room mattered. "The boy needs a nap at noon, and the girl needs her tablet charged. Do not ruin my weekend by calling me about stupid little things. Devin is dropping off his golf clubs later, so make sure you open the garage door for him." I stared down at the heavy bag resting against my feet. I looked at the rain lashing hard against the front window. I looked at my mother glaring at me expectantly, clearly waiting for my usual quiet submission. I looked at my father, who was still completely ignoring my existence in favor of his glowing screen. And finally, I looked at Ashley, the golden child who had never worked a single hard day in her life, treating me like nothing more than hired help she had forgotten to pay. Every single day of my childhood had led, inevitably, to this exact moment. Every dismissed accomplishment, every mocked ambition, every time I was told my only value in this family was serving a sister who quietly despised me. They thought they had broken me down so thoroughly that I would simply accept this final humiliation without a fight. They genuinely believed they owned my future outright. I did not argue anymore. I did not scream, and I did not cry. A sudden, freezing clarity washed over my mind completely, cold and total. I grabbed my portfolio tightly and stepped right over the diaper bag. I walked straight out into the cold, driving storm, leaving them all behind forever. As my foot cleared the heavy canvas bag, my father finally looked up from his glowing tablet screen, his expression sharpening into something almost startled. His voice boomed across the entire living room, unusually sharp and threatening. "If you walk out that door, you are no longer part of this family," he shouted after me. "We will cut off your health insurance, and I am taking back the keys to your car. You will have absolutely nothing left." I reached into my coat pocket, pulled out the key ring to the beat-up sedan they had held over my head for years like a leash, and dropped it onto the hallway table without ceremony. The metal clattered loudly, echoing down the narrow hallway like a small, final verdict. I did not use the front entrance. Brenda was still blocking it, fully expecting me to shove past her in tears. Instead, I pivoted sharply, marched straight through our narrow kitchen, threw open the back door, and plunged headfirst into the torrential downpour outside. The freezing rain was absolutely merciless. It struck my cheap suit like 1,000 icy needles, soaking straight through the thin polyester fabric within seconds. I had nearly 2 miles to run before reaching the nearest subway station. Every single step felt like wading through freezing wet concrete. My discount store heels offered no protection whatsoever against the flooded sidewalks. The cheap glue binding the soles together began to dissolve almost immediately. Water seeped inside, soaking my bare feet and turning each stride into a slippery, painful struggle. I focused entirely on the heavy leather portfolio clutched tight against my chest. It contained my financial models, my case studies, and my only real way out of this nightmare. I wrapped both arms around it, shielding it from the rain with my own shivering body, as if it were the only thing left in the world worth protecting. Cars sped past me, splashing filthy water against my legs. I absolutely did not stop, not even for a second. My lungs burned with the frigid air, and my muscles ached down to the bone. By the time I finally reached the subway terminal, I was drenched to the skin. I swiped my transit card with numb, trembling fingers and rushed down the slick stairs. The underground station offered a small measure of shelter, but the damage was already thoroughly done. My blazer clung heavily to my shivering shoulders. Commuters stared at me with a mixture of pity and disgust, shifting away from the growing puddle of wet footprints I left across the platform. I ignored every single one of them. I boarded the train, gripping the metal handrail tightly to keep my shaking legs from finally giving out beneath me. I closed my eyes and forced my mind to compartmentalize the physical misery entirely. I pushed away the image of Ashley lounging comfortably in her cashmere sweater. I erased the sound of my father coldly threatening my livelihood. I channeled every ounce of my burning rage into pure, calculating focus. I mentally reviewed the complex corporate valuation models I had memorized over months of studying. I visualized balance sheets and leveraged buyout structures scrolling behind my closed eyelids. I turned my anger, deliberately and methodically, into a weapon I could actually use. I emerged from the subway station and stood before the towering glass and steel skyscraper rising up in the financial district. The headquarters of the most ruthless mergers and acquisitions firm in the city looked coldly intimidating, gleaming even under the gray storm clouds. I walked through the revolving doors, leaving a trail of rainwater across the pristine marble lobby floor. The security guards eyed my ruined shoes and soaked clothes with obvious skepticism, but my name was already on the executive visitor list, and that was all that mattered. The receptionist on the 40th floor looked genuinely horrified when I stepped out of the elevator. She handed me a box of tissues, clearly assuming I would rush to the restroom to fix my ruined appearance. I took exactly one tissue, wiped the rainwater carefully from my portfolio's leather cover, and told her, quite calmly, that I was ready to see the managing partners. I was escorted into a massive glass-walled boardroom. 3 senior executives sat at the far end of a long mahogany table, wearing bespoke tailored suits and projecting an aura of absolute, unshakable corporate dominance. When they looked up and saw me standing there, soaked and shivering, the entire room fell silent. They clearly expected a frantic apology. They expected me to shrink, to offer pathetic excuses about the weather, to beg quietly for their understanding. I did not give them a single word of apology. I walked confidently to the chair directly opposite them, sat down with perfect posture, and placed my dry portfolio squarely on the polished table between us. "I am ready to begin," I stated, my voice steady, cold, and entirely devoid of emotion. The lead partner, a sharp-eyed man in his 50s, raised one eyebrow slowly. He exchanged a brief, unreadable look with his colleagues. Without asking a single question about my appearance, he slid a thick, complex financial dossier across the table toward me. It was a brutal, leveraged buyout case study, clearly designed to overwhelm and eliminate weaker candidates. He gave me 10 minutes to read it and propose a full restructuring strategy on the spot. I did not need 10 minutes. I opened the file, my eyes scanning the intricate web of debt structures, equity distributions, and cash flow projections laid out before me. I saw the hidden liabilities almost immediately. I saw the bloated management expenses and the wildly inefficient asset allocations buried beneath layers of corporate jargon. I looked up at the partners. "This target company is bleeding capital through gross mismanagement of its supply chain," I began, my tone authoritative and completely relentless. "You do not need to assume their existing debt at all. You strip the secondary assets, liquidate the underperforming regional divisions, and restructure the executive compensation packages from the ground up. If you execute a hostile takeover and replace the chief financial officer entirely, you increase the profit margin. I paused, clearing my throat once. By 40% within the first 2 quarters alone. I systematically dismantled the entire financial structure of the company right there at the table. I cited specific tax loopholes, identified redundant operational costs buried in the footnotes, and proposed a ruthless consolidation strategy designed to maximize shareholder value while eliminating every ounce of dead weight. I spoke with the icy precision of someone who genuinely had nothing left to lose. I did not hesitate once. I did not falter once. I delivered the entire analysis with absolute, unshakable confidence from start to finish. The 3 managing partners sat in stunned silence, staring at me, completely captivated by the brilliant, aggressive strategy I had just laid out cold on their own table. The lead partner closed the thick financial dossier very slowly, deliberately. He looked at my soaked jacket, my completely ruined shoes, and then directly, searchingly, into my eyes. He saw the sheer, unyielding hunger driving me forward. He saw someone who would ruthlessly tear through any obstacle placed in front of her, just to win. He finally smiled a cold, approving smile. "You are hired," the lead partner said, his voice cutting cleanly through the heavy silence of the boardroom. "We need someone exactly like you on this floor." I stood up, shook his hand with a firm, unwavering grip, and walked out of that glass-walled room without looking back once. My clothes were still clinging uncomfortably to my skin, and my ruined shoes squelched loudly against the polished marble floor of the corridor, but I had never in my life felt more powerful. I rode the elevator down to the lobby, watching the floor numbers descend one by one on the glowing digital display. I had actually done it. I had secured a position at the single most prestigious firm in the entire city, locking in a salary that would finally break the chains of my crushing debt. I pushed through the revolving doors and stepped back out onto the wet street. The rain had finally stopped, leaving the pavement slick and reflecting the flat gray city sky above. I pulled my phone from my pocket and held down the power button. The screen illuminated slowly, and my device immediately began vibrating violently in my hand, almost angrily. Notifications flooded the screen in a relentless, frantic wave. I stood there on the crowded sidewalk and simply stared at the damage unfolding in real time. There were 47 missed calls. Most were from my mother, a handful from my father, and several more from Ashley. They had clearly panicked the moment their unpaid babysitter had actually dared to choose her own future over their endless convenience. I opened my messages and found a massive block of text from Brenda waiting for me. It was not a message asking if I was safe. It was not an apology of any kind. "You embarrassed your sister," the text read. "Devin had to cancel his golf game just to watch his own children. You are completely selfish and ungrateful. You are dead to us. Do not bother coming back for your things. We are throwing your trash out on the curb." I read the words twice, letting the cold, undeniable reality of my own mother's hatred wash over me completely. They had actually done it. They had discarded me entirely over one single canceled brunch. I did not type a response. I did not call her back to beg or explain myself. I simply hit the block button on her number. Then I blocked my father. Then I blocked Ashley, and then Devin right after. I severed the digital ties with the exact same clinical precision I used to analyze corporate debt structures. I had nothing left in the entire world but the clothes on my back and the portfolio still clutched in my hands. I was starting over completely, from absolute zero. That night, I slept on a lumpy futon in the tiny studio apartment belonging to my old college roommate. She lent me a dry sweatshirt and a pair of worn sweatpants without a single question asked. I stared up at the water-stained ceiling, listening to sirens wailing somewhere out in the dark city streets. I had no savings, no car, and no family left to speak of. My entire childhood, every possession I had ever owned, was sitting in black garbage bags on a wet sidewalk back in Connecticut, already forgotten. But as I lay there in the dark, I felt an overwhelming, almost dizzying sense of freedom. The heavy, suffocating weight of their expectations was finally, permanently gone. They could no longer use their conditional love as a leash to manipulate me into obedience. I was entirely, solely responsible for my own survival now, and strangely enough, I welcomed the challenge with open arms. The very next morning, I used a high-interest payday loan to buy 3 generic business suits from a discount clearance rack. I moved into a cheap, windowless room in a shared apartment out in Queens. I showed up at the firm a full hour before anyone else arrived, and I left long after every senior executive had already gone home for the night. My first year at the firm was an absolute gauntlet from beginning to end. I worked 80-hour weeks as a matter of routine. I ate dinner alone at my desk, highlighting balance sheets and digging methodically through corporate tax filings late into the night. The other junior associates constantly complained about the grueling hours and the crushing pressure, but I genuinely thrived inside of it. I channeled every ounce of my buried rage, every memory of my father's casual dismissal, and every echoing insult from my mother directly into my work, refining it into fuel. I became a machine, plain and simple. Financial modeling became my sanctuary in a world that had given me nothing else. When I looked at numbers, they made perfect, uncomplicated sense. They did not lie to me, they did not manipulate me, and they never once played favorites. While I was meticulously building my career in complete silence, my family continued living out their extravagant, self-satisfied delusion. I caught glimpses of their public social media posts through a handful of mutual connections. Ashley and Devin were constantly taking luxury vacations, posting pictures from 5-star resorts in Aspen and first-class airport lounges on their way to Europe. The captions always praised Devin for being such a brilliant, successful executive. But my newly trained financial eye knew far better than that. I knew exactly what a startup chief financial officer actually earned, and it certainly did not cover weekly shopping sprees at luxury boutiques on top of international travel. My parents, I would later understand, were quietly funding their lavish lifestyle from behind the scenes, draining their own retirement accounts just to maintain the golden child and her carefully curated image. They were buying, quite literally, the illusion of a perfect family. I ignored their performative happiness entirely and focused every waking hour on my own ascent instead. My cold, analytical approach to business made me swiftly indispensable to the managing partners above me. I never let emotion cloud my judgment, not even once. I gutted failing companies with ruthless surgical efficiency. I negotiated mergers that visibly intimidated executives twice my age and decades my senior. Every single time I dismantled a corrupt corporate structure, I felt like I was tearing down the very same systems of unearned entitlement that my sister and my brother-in-law so perfectly represented in miniature. The pain of my family's betrayal hardened, slowly but surely, into an untouchable, impenetrable armor around my heart. I earned my first major promotion within 18 months. My salary doubled, and then my bonus tripled it on top of that. I paid off my remaining student loans in a single wire transfer. I moved out of that windowless room in Queens and leased a sleek, modern apartment overlooking the glittering city skyline. I bought a handful of beautiful, tailored suits that actually fit. I was accumulating power, wealth, and influence at an unprecedented rate, but I kept my life almost entirely private throughout it all. I did not post photos of my promotions. I did not flaunt my rapidly growing income. I operated in total, deliberate silence, understanding on a deep level that true power never needs an audience to validate it. I was quietly, patiently sharpening my skills, day after day after day. 3 years after my original escape, my quiet dedication finally paid off in a massive, undeniable way. I was exactly 30 years old when the managing partners called me into the glass boardroom, not to test my skills this time, but to formally offer me a seat at the table. I was officially promoted to junior partner. My compensation package shifted overnight from a generous salary into equity shares and profit percentages. The numbers on my bank statements became genuinely staggering. I was making more money in a single quarter than my father had earned across his entire career combined. And yet my lifestyle remained entirely understated, almost invisible by design. I did not buy a flashy sports car or a sprawling suburban estate to show it off. I invested my capital aggressively instead, diversifying quietly and relentlessly. I purchased a minimalist penthouse in a highly secure building, but I furnished it sparingly, with clean, functional pieces rather than ostentatious displays. I hired a private wealth manager to funnel my earnings into diversified portfolios and carefully anonymous holding companies. I learned very early on that new money screams for attention, but true, lasting wealth simply whispers. My colleagues bought luxury vehicles and wore their annual bonuses openly on their wrists. I wore bespoke, unbranded suits instead, and drove a modest hybrid car that drew no attention whatsoever. I kept my footprint incredibly small on purpose. I wanted my bank accounts heavy and my public presence entirely, deliberately invisible. One rainy Tuesday afternoon, that carefully guarded desire for anonymity was severely tested for the first time. I was walking through an upscale grocery store near my office, carrying a small basket of imported produce, when I heard a sharp, unmistakable gasp behind me. I turned around and locked eyes with my Aunt Beatrice. She was the older sister of my mother, a woman who had always thrived openly on suburban gossip and family drama of every kind. She looked at my simple gray trench coat and my completely bare, unmade-up face. I had just finished an exhausting financial audit and had skipped makeup entirely that morning. She gripped her shopping cart tightly with both hands and stared at me as if she had just seen an actual ghost standing in the produce aisle. "Samantha," she whispered, taking a hesitant step backward as though I might vanish again. "We all thought you were living out on the streets." I raised a single eyebrow, carefully maintaining a perfectly neutral expression. I asked her, quite evenly, what exactly she meant by that. Beatrice leaned in close, her eyes darting nervously around the aisles as if she were sharing a top-secret state mystery with me. "Your mother and father told everyone about your terrible mental breakdown," she said, her voice dripping with obviously fake pity. "They said you snapped under the pressure of trying to compete with Ashley. They told the entire extended family that you ran away, dropped completely out of society, and were living in absolute poverty somewhere in a dangerous neighborhood." I stood completely still, quietly digesting the sheer magnitude of their deception. My parents had engineered an elaborate, deeply damaging smear campaign purely to cover up the fact that I had successfully escaped their control. They could not handle the social embarrassment of a daughter cutting them off entirely, so instead, they had painted me as a mentally unstable failure to save face. It was a brilliant, malicious little tactic, carefully designed to protect their perfect public image while systematically destroying mine in private. Beatrice patted my arm with a condescending little sigh. "It is such a tragedy, Samantha, especially when you look at how beautifully Ashley and Devin are doing these days. They are the ultimate success story, you know. Devin was just featured in a local business magazine, and your parents bought 50 copies of it. Ashley is basically a celebrity in their social circle now. They just bought a second vacation home, and your parents could not possibly be prouder. It really is a shame you could not follow their excellent example, dear. If you ever need a hot meal, you know you can always call me." I looked at my aunt, quietly taking in her patronizing smile and her cheap costume jewelry glinting under the store lights. I could have crushed her entire worldview right then and there, without breaking a sweat. I could have pulled out my phone and shown her the running balance of my offshore investment accounts. I could have told her, quite plainly, that my firm handled transactions worth more than the gross domestic product of entire small countries. I could have casually mentioned, almost in passing, that I had dinner with actual billionaires on a regular weekly basis. The urge to correct the rumor burned incredibly strong inside me. I wanted to watch her jaw drop open. I wanted to shatter the carefully constructed narrative my parents had built and expose them, once and for all, as bitter, rejected liars in front of the whole family. But my corporate training kicked in almost automatically. In the world of elite finance, you never reveal your hand until the exact moment you are truly ready to strike. You let your competitors believe they hold the upper hand. You let them grow arrogant, lazy, and careless in their false sense of security. Silence, I had learned, is never weakness. Silence is the single greatest tactical advantage a person can possess. I looked at Beatrice and forced a small, utterly pathetic smile onto my face. "Thank you, Aunt Beatrice," I said softly, looking down at my shoes as if genuinely ashamed. "I am just trying to survive day by day. Please tell my parents I am doing my best." Beatrice looked deeply, thoroughly satisfied with my miserable little performance. She gave me one last pitying look and pushed her cart onward down the aisle without another word. I walked to the register, paid for my groceries using a black titanium corporate card, and stepped calmly into my waiting private car. I leaned back against the smooth leather seat and let out a genuine, predatory laugh that echoed through the quiet cabin. They thought I was drowning at the very bottom of the ocean. They genuinely believed that without their guidance and financial support, I had crumbled into a broken, worthless mess of a person. They were actively using my supposed misery to quietly elevate their own hollow achievements in front of the entire family. I realized then, with total clarity, that my parents, along with Ashley and Devin, were building a massive house of cards on a foundation made entirely of lies. I decided right then and there to fully embrace their ridiculous smear campaign rather than fight it. I would let them sleep soundly at night, wrapped snugly in their delusions of superiority. I would let Devin boast endlessly about his fraudulent corporate titles and his flashy borrowed lifestyle. I would remain an anonymous phantom, an invisible force in the background, quietly manipulating the markets that would eventually bury them. Anonymity, I came to understand, provided me with unrestricted access to information. Because no one was actively looking for me, no one ever saw me coming. I kept my head down and focused strictly, obsessively, on the numbers in front of me. I sharpened my skills, day after day, without fail. Those sharpened skills quickly transformed me into the single most feared executive in the entire New York financial district. My partners stopped sending me into standard negotiations and started deploying me instead as their ultimate weapon of choice. Within the industry, I earned an entirely new title. They began calling me the corporate Grim Reaper. Whenever a mid-sized corporation or a bloated technology startup began bleeding capital uncontrollably, my firm bought up their distressed debt and sent me in personally to handle the execution. I did not negotiate gently with failing executives. I walked into their mahogany boardrooms, dropped my financial autopsy reports squarely onto their tables, and systematically dismantled their entire operations piece by piece. I fired incompetent management teams without a single ounce of hesitation or remorse. I possessed a unique, almost terrifying ability to look at a tangled web of corporate subsidiaries, offshore accounts, and falsified revenue projections, and instantly spot the rot hiding underneath it all. I stripped away unnecessary departments, liquidated useless assets, and restructured crushing debt loads into genuinely profitable margins within months. I was completely unburdened by emotion or empathy in these moments. When you have survived absolute betrayal from your own blood family, firing a negligent chief executive officer feels like absolutely nothing at all. I viewed businesses as complex puzzles made entirely of cash flow and liabilities. If a component did not generate real value, I simply eliminated it without a second thought. My aggressive restructuring strategies generated massive returns for my firm, and my personal wealth skyrocketed accordingly, year after year. I finally purchased a breathtaking luxury penthouse in a highly secure, exclusive building in Manhattan. I paid entirely in cash, without a mortgage or a single loan attached to it. The residence featured floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city skyline, private elevator access, and a dedicated round-the-clock security detail. It was, in every sense, a fortress of solitude and hard-earned success. My family, of course, had absolutely no idea any of this was happening. They still believed the pathetic fiction my mother had spun about my supposed mental collapse and extreme poverty. I allowed them to keep their comfortable delusions, while I quietly enjoyed the highest echelon of corporate luxury behind closed doors. I did not flaunt my wealth publicly. I found public displays of money genuinely distasteful, almost vulgar. Unfortunately, my sister and her husband held the exact opposite philosophy in every possible way. I kept a quiet, anonymous eye on their public social media profiles from a distance. Ashley and Devin were completely addicted to the validation of their followers online. Their digital footprint had become an endless, nauseating parade of extreme wealth exhibition. Devin, presenting himself as the brilliant, trailblazing financial genius of his generation, constantly posted videos from the deck of a newly purchased luxury yacht. He smoked imported cigars on camera and tagged his location at the most exclusive private marinas up and down the coast. Ashley treated her entire online presence like a personal reality television show. She regularly posted unboxing videos featuring $20,000 designer handbags. She flaunted diamond tennis bracelets, documented extensive renovations on their second vacation home in painstaking detail, and posted receipts from their most extravagant dining experiences for all to see. They wanted the entire world to know, unmistakably, that they had made it. My parents frequently commented on every single photo, praising Devin endlessly for his supposed business acumen and calling Ashley a true inspiration to the whole family. I sat in my pristine penthouse one quiet evening, sipping a glass of vintage wine, and looked over their digital circus with my highly trained financial eye. My mind automatically began to run the numbers behind the scenes, almost against my own will. I treated their public lifestyle exactly like one of my corporate restructuring targets at work. I calculated the average maintenance costs, docking fees, and insurance premiums required for a luxury yacht of that size. I estimated the property taxes and mortgage rates on both their primary residence and their new vacation home. I tallied up the cost of Ashley's designer wardrobe, their frequent international first-class flights, and the high-end vehicles they constantly showcased online. I built a comprehensive mental spreadsheet of their total annual burn rate, line by line. Then I cross-referenced those staggering expenditures against their actual, verifiable professional positions. Devin was the chief financial officer of a small lifestyle startup. Ashley was their vice president of marketing, nothing more. I knew the exact compensation brackets for those specific roles in the current corporate market, down to the last detail. Even with the most aggressive equity packages and maximum performance bonuses imaginable, their legitimate combined income could never possibly sustain that level of astronomical spending. The math simply, plainly, did not add up. They were hemorrhaging cash at a rate typically reserved for actual billionaires, not mid-level startup executives working a 9-to-5. Startups, as any professional in my field knows, are notoriously cash poor, relying heavily on venture capital funding rounds just to keep the lights on until they eventually reach profitability. A startup chief financial officer simply does not have the liquid capital sitting around to casually purchase a yacht outright. A cold, sharp realization settled slowly over me. There was only one possible way Devon could actually afford to finance that specific lifestyle. He had to be redirecting company funds directly into his own accounts. The extravagant trips, the $20,000 handbags, and the boat itself were not the fruits of his supposed brilliant labor at all. They were massive, glaring red flags of blatant corporate embezzlement hiding in plain sight. He was using his position as chief financial officer to quietly siphon venture capital straight into his own pockets, one transaction at a time. My parents were proudly financing their own delusion by worshiping a man who was, in reality, committing blatant federal wire fraud right under their noses. I stared at a photograph of Devon smiling on his yacht, and a dangerous, predatory thrill washed over me completely. He was sloppy. He was arrogant. He was leaving a massive trail of financial evidence hidden in plain sight for anyone patient enough to look. I opened a completely secure secondary window on my computer and deliberately began downloading every single public image they had ever posted. I created a heavily encrypted directory specifically designed to archive their digital arrogance for later use. I saved the receipts, the timestamps, and the exact geographical coordinates embedded in each photo. I watched my sister pose in front of a private jet she could never legitimately afford, wearing diamonds that were, in every meaningful sense, stolen. The sheer audacity of their behavior was genuinely breathtaking to witness. They were openly mocking the entire financial regulatory system without even realizing it. I poured myself another glass of wine and smiled quietly to myself. Their spectacular downfall was now, effectively, guaranteed. Their house of cards would eventually collapse under its own considerable weight. I simply did not need to intervene directly, not yet. I just needed to wait patiently for the inevitable moment when their stolen capital finally ran out and the creditors came knocking at their door. I closed my laptop and went to sleep that night, knowing, with complete certainty, that the ultimate reckoning was already quietly in motion. 7 years passed since that rain-soaked morning I walked away from my family for good. I was now 34 years old and officially a senior partner at the firm. I had cornered the market on corporate restructuring, turning absolute ruins into highly profitable empires, time and time again. My corner office on the 60th floor featured floor-to-ceiling windows looking directly out over the sprawling financial district of Manhattan below. The heavy mahogany door to my suite remained firmly closed to anyone below the executive tier without an appointment. I commanded a team of 30 ruthless analysts and junior partners who anticipated my every directive before I even had to voice it aloud. I did not take vacations. I did not waste time on trivial social engagements of any kind. I lived entirely for the flawless execution of financial strategy and nothing else. I had cultivated a reputation as an apex predator within the private equity sector. When my name appeared on a term sheet, chief executive officers everywhere knew, instinctively, that their company was about to be gutted, cleaned, and sold off piece by piece to the highest bidder. The terrified, soaking wet 27-year-old girl running desperately through the subway terminal was completely gone forever, erased entirely. In her place stood a woman forged in absolute isolation and relentless financial discipline. I had reached the undeniable absolute peak of my industry, completely undetected by the very people who shared my blood. My parents still firmly believed I was a destitute failure suffering from permanent mental instability somewhere out there in the world. I allowed them to keep their comforting lies, while I quietly accumulated vast wealth and unyielding authority behind the scenes. My entire existence was dedicated to achieving absolute perfection in every single corporate transaction I handled, without exception. I had become an unstoppable, dominant force of nature within my field. It was a perfectly standard Thursday morning when the universe finally delivered the perfect, inevitable collision of my past and my present. My lead acquisitions manager walked briskly into my office and placed a thick black portfolio directly onto the center of my pristine desk without a word. It was a distressed asset file, marked clearly for a highly aggressive potential hostile takeover. The target company was called Lux Life. It was a high-end lifestyle and wellness brand that had initially captured massive market share through aggressive social media marketing and a handful of celebrity endorsements early on. The manager briefed me quickly before leaving the room to attend another meeting. Lux Life was actively bleeding cash at an unprecedented, catastrophic rate. They had secured massive rounds of venture capital funding over the past 3 years, but their operational costs were inexplicably soaring, even as their actual profit margins plummeted straight into the abyss. They were currently defaulting on multiple high-interest commercial loans and desperately seeking an emergency financial bailout to avoid total corporate bankruptcy within weeks. Our firm was, quite literally, their absolute last resort. If we did not inject capital and assume controlling interest within the next 14 days, the company would be completely liquidated on the spot. Furthermore, their executive board would face severe federal scrutiny for gross financial negligence, massive corporate waste, and potential large-scale investor fraud. I waited for the manager to close the heavy door behind him before I finally reached for the black portfolio myself. I opened the thick leather cover and began scanning the executive summary line by line. My eyes darted across the pages, instantly absorbing the catastrophic data laid out before me. The revenue projections were absolute garbage, completely fabricated to artificially inflate the overall company valuation on paper. The operational burn rate was staggering, indicating a complete lack of internal financial controls or even basic accounting ethics. Millions of dollars were categorized under vague, undefined consulting fees and mysterious external marketing ventures that led nowhere. It was an absolute mess of corporate mismanagement from top to bottom. The balance sheet looked exactly like a financial crime scene, waiting patiently to be uncovered by federal auditors. The sheer magnitude of the financial negligence was genuinely offensive to my professional sensibilities as I read further. I turned the page to the organizational chart, wanting to see exactly who was responsible for driving a highly lucrative brand straight into the ground through sheer incompetence or greed. My eyes tracked steadily down the detailed list of executive officers, carefully evaluating their credentials and their exorbitant compensation packages one by one. I stopped breathing entirely. The air in my corner office suddenly went perfectly, unnervingly still. I stared at the crisp, black ink printed neatly on the high-quality paper in front of me. I read the names twice, deliberately, to make absolutely certain my mind was not playing cruel tricks on me. Vice President of Marketing, Ashley. Chief Financial Officer, Devin. The names jumped off the page like a glaring neon sign warning of impending disaster. I sat back slowly in my leather executive chair and stared up at the ceiling, letting the full weight of the moment finally settle over me. The sheer, terrifying irony of the situation washed over me in a massive, breathtaking wave of sudden realization. The golden child who had once dropped a diaper bag at my feet and ordered me not to ruin her weekend was now the vice president of marketing responsible for burning through millions of investor dollars on fake, hollow campaigns. The arrogant man who had mocked my discount clothes while parading around on a luxury yacht, funded entirely by stolen money, was the chief financial officer now begging my firm to save him from federal prison. They had come, hats in hand, to the single most ruthless private equity firm in Manhattan, desperately pleading for a multi-million-dollar lifeline just to maintain their fraudulent suburban paradise a little longer. They had submitted their heavily manipulated financial records, hoping to fool a team of anonymous corporate investors sitting somewhere behind closed doors. They had absolutely no idea that the senior partner assigned to audit their books, determine their absolute fate, and ultimately control their entire corporate existence was the exact same sister they had discarded like trash 7 long years ago. I looked back down at the executive summary, at their smiling, arrogant corporate headshots staring up at me from the glossy page. I did not feel an ounce of pity. I did not feel any lingering familial obligation or any residual childhood guilt whatsoever. A cold, deeply predatory smile spread slowly across my face. They thought they had buried me. They did not realize they had simply planted a seed, one that had grown and sent me straight to the absolute top of the entire financial food chain. And now they were walking blindly, willingly, right into my completely inescapable corporate slaughterhouse. I picked up my heavy gold fountain pen and deliberately signed my initials across the front cover of the file, officially claiming the target as my own. Let the hostile games begin. I immediately locked down the entire acquisition process under a strict shroud of absolute secrecy. In the world of high-stakes private equity, revealing your identity before the trap finally snaps shut is a fatal, amateur mistake, one I had no intention of making. I directed my executive assistant to draft the preliminary letters of intent using our standard corporate letterhead, explicitly omitting my signature from every single page. I assigned a ruthless external proxy lawyer to act as the primary point of contact for the executive board of Lux Life. He was a towering, intimidating corporate litigator who specialized in aggressive negotiations and asked absolutely no questions whatsoever about my underlying motives. He would handle all the video conferences, the demanding emails, and the initial rounds of legal posturing on my behalf, entirely insulated from my true identity. As far as Ashley and Devin knew, their desperate plea for a financial bailout was being evaluated by a faceless committee of aging corporate men sitting somewhere in a sterile boardroom. They genuinely believed they were successfully charming a standard group of naive investors. They had no idea that every single document, every fabricated revenue projection, and every desperate email they submitted was being routed directly, invisibly, to my own secure private server. I became an invisible predator, silently circling my prey from a great distance. I instructed my proxy lawyer to demand full, unredacted access to their general ledger and all internal expense reports going back 36 months, claiming it was a mandatory prerequisite for our funding approval to move forward. Devin, blinded by his own panic and staggering arrogance, complied without a single fight or objection. He enthusiastically handed over the keys to his completely fraudulent kingdom, practically gift-wrapped. The massive data dump arrived on my secure terminal precisely at midnight. I dismissed my entire analytical team for the evening, locked my office doors behind me, and carried the heavily encrypted hard drive back to my minimalist penthouse. I brewed a massive pot of dark roast espresso and sat down at my expansive glass desk. The glowing monitors illuminated the dark, silent room as the clock slowly ticked its way toward 3 o'clock in the morning. I plunged headfirst into the raw financial disclosures of Lux Life. An ordinary analyst would have looked at the massive revenue deficits, quickly dismissed the company as a total write-off, and moved on to a safer, less complicated asset. I was not an ordinary analyst. I was performing a highly aggressive financial autopsy on the very people who had deliberately, methodically destroyed my youth. I tore through the corporate tax filings, the vendor invoices, and the bloated payroll records with cold, mechanical precision, page after page. Every single number told a desperate, pathetic story of unchecked greed. The company had initially generated massive consumer interest, securing tens of millions of dollars in venture capital funding, but the executive team had treated that capital like an unlimited personal bank account with no accountability attached to it whatsoever. They lacked any fundamental understanding of corporate governance or basic fiduciary duty. They were, in every meaningful sense, simply teenagers playing dress-up with millions of dollars that rightfully belonged to institutional investors. The gross mismanagement was so blatant it was practically screaming off the glowing screens in front of me. I needed to isolate the primary source of the aggressive cash bleed before exposing the deeper, systemic rot underneath it. I chose to aggressively target the marketing department first. It was the massive division controlled entirely by my spoiled golden child sister. Ashley had been handed the title of vice president despite having absolutely zero formal education in business strategy or consumer analytics of any kind. I opened her comprehensive monthly budget report and immediately burst into cold, cynical laughter. Her entire divisional strategy was a masterpiece of staggering incompetence, laid bare in black and white. According to the official corporate ledger, the marketing department was burning through $2 million every single quarter, yet their actual customer acquisition rate was virtually non-existent within the broader market. She had bloated her staff with useless lifestyle consultants, personal assistants, and expensive party planners. Instead of purchasing targeted digital advertisements or securing viable retail partnerships, she was throwing massive, pointless industry parties simply to boost her own personal social status among her peers. I meticulously cross-referenced the company credit card statements assigned directly to her name against the official promotional calendar sitting on file. The overlap was incredibly damning, almost comically so. Every single time she posted a glamorous vacation photo on her private social media accounts, a matching corporate expense was simultaneously logged into the company books that same week. She genuinely thought she was being clever by hiding her personal vanity projects behind vague corporate terminology. I highlighted line after line of fraudulent expenditures, one after another. The sheer, arrogant audacity of her endless entitlement was breathtaking to witness up close. She genuinely believed that because she possessed a lofty corporate title, the basic rules of financial accountability simply did not apply to her daily operations whatsoever. I zoomed in on the most flagrant violations buried deep within her extensive corporate expense reports. I found a massive charge for first-class round-trip tickets to Paris, accompanied by a luxury hotel stay at an exclusive five-star boutique resort. Ashley had boldly labeled this lavish $50,000 European vacation under the incredibly vague category of influencer outreach and brand networking. A few pages later, I uncovered an outrageous receipt from a high-end boutique located in Manhattan. She had charged a staggering $50,000 jewelry spree directly to the startup, claiming the diamond bracelets and gold necklaces were essential expenditures for brand marketing and corporate aesthetic development. The absolute incompetence displayed across these pages was truly staggering to behold. She was blatantly stealing cash from her own corporate investors just to play pretend on the internet, one designer bag at a time. But as I continued to dig deeper into the general ledger, a much darker reality began to slowly emerge from the numbers. Ashley was incredibly foolish, but her sisterly greed was nothing compared to the massive financial deception orchestrated by her own husband. Her petty theft was merely the absolute tip of a deeply terrifying iceberg. The money she was burning through was actually coming from a highly complex network of offshore holding companies. Devin, the brilliantly arrogant chief financial officer, was moving capital in ways that Ashley could never possibly comprehend on her own. As the bright morning sun finally began to rise slowly over the sleeping city, I opened the main treasury files and prepared to completely decimate my brother-in-law's carefully built empire of lies. I walked into the firm at 7 o'clock that morning, carrying the encrypted hard drive like a loaded weapon in my hand. The executive floor was completely silent, but my elite team of forensic accountants was already assembled and waiting in the secure briefing room. I did not bother with pleasantries or the usual morning greetings. I plugged the drive directly into the main terminal and projected the corrupted financial ledgers across the massive wall screens for everyone to see. My team consisted of former federal agents and the most aggressive corporate auditors working in the city. They were rigorously trained to hunt hidden assets and dismantle complex financial crimes without mercy. I pointed a laser pointer directly at the Treasury files associated with the Chief Financial Officer's office. I looked around the room at my specialized team and gave them one single, unwavering directive. I told them to ignore the petty marketing waste entirely and follow the wire transfers of the Chief Financial Officer exclusively, without distraction. I wanted every single external corporate account, every offshore holding entity, and every hidden transaction traced back to its absolute point of origin. I demanded a complete, exhaustive forensic map of his entire financial network within 48 hours, no exceptions. They immediately went to work, unleashing their proprietary tracing software on the corrupted general ledger without delay. While my team tore relentlessly through the digital transaction history, I returned to my corner office and stood staring out at the sprawling city below. My mind automatically drifted back to the suffocating family dinners we used to endure before my escape all those years ago. I vividly remembered sitting at the long mahogany dining table, listening to Devon hold court like a king before his subjects. He loved to position himself as a financial visionary and an absolute titan of modern wealth management. He would constantly brag about his complex offshore investment strategies to my hopelessly impressed parents, who ate up every single word. He spoke loudly about optimizing tax burdens and leveraging international corporate structures, throwing around jargon he barely understood. My father would hang on his every word, treating Devon like a reigning king of Wall Street who had personally chosen our family to bless. Devon loved to use those quiet moments to humiliate me publicly, almost as a form of entertainment. He would look at my tired eyes and my cheap business suit, swirling his expensive imported cognac with a condescending smirk plastered across his face. He would shake his head slowly and loudly pity me for working what he called a pathetic wage slave job beneath him. He told the entire table that real wealth was never built by clocking hours for a corporate boss like some kind of drone. He insisted that people like me were destined to stay poor forever, because we supposedly lacked the vision necessary to manipulate the global market in our favor. My parents would nod along eagerly, agreeing wholeheartedly that I lacked the intelligence to understand high-level finance the way Devon so clearly did. I never argued with him during those dinners. I just sat quietly eating my food, absorbing every single insult without a word of protest. I knew even back then that his arrogant posturing masked a deep, fundamental ignorance of actual economic principles underneath the surface. He used buzzwords to sound sophisticated, but his real understanding of corporate finance was entirely superficial, a costume he wore well. He was a charismatic salesman playing dress-up in the role of a serious financial executive. Now, sitting in my penthouse office years later, I knew my silent patience was finally about to pay off in the most devastating way imaginable. 2 days later, my lead forensic auditor walked into my office without a word. He did not smile. He handed me a thick red folder containing the final financial mapping report, laid out in exhaustive detail. He told me, quite plainly, that the entire corporate structure of the target company was a massive, highly illegal illusion from top to bottom. The numbers were worse than I could have ever imagined, even after everything I had already uncovered. The audit revealed exactly how Devon was funding his luxury yachts and international vacations all along. He had systematically set up a complex web of over 20 dummy limited liability companies, registered quietly in various tax havens around the world. He was taking the massive venture capital injections intended for product development and corporate expansion and wiring the funds directly into these ghost entities instead. He categorized the illegal transfers as external vendor payments, consulting retainers, and international software licensing fees, burying them deep in the paperwork. Once the stolen capital hit the offshore accounts, Devon would immediately launder the money back into his own personal domestic trusts, clean and untraceable on the surface. He was actively using millions of dollars of investor money to personally fund his and Ashley's lavish lifestyle, dollar by stolen dollar. It was not a case of poor management or aggressive accounting errors. It was textbook wire fraud and massive corporate embezzlement, prosecutable at the federal level. My auditor pointed to the specific transaction logs detailing the transfer of funds used to purchase the very yacht Devon so proudly flaunted online. The money trail was completely, undeniably clear. The digital fingerprints of the chief financial officer were permanently stamped all over every single fraudulent wire transfer in the file. He had left a glaring trail of digital evidence that any competent federal investigator would uncover within the hour. He was so blinded by his own arrogance and his desperate need to project immense wealth that he genuinely believed he was untouchable. He thought he could outsmart the entire financial system simply because no one had ever bothered to challenge him before. I closed the red folder slowly and placed my hands flat on my glass desk. The sheer magnitude of his financial crimes meant he was facing decades in a federal penitentiary, at minimum. He had actively defrauded major institutional investors, falsified corporate tax returns, and committed interstate wire fraud on a massive scale. There was absolutely no corporate loophole or legal maneuver left that could save him from the staggering legal consequences bearing down on him. I realized then that my sister and my brother-in-law were not simply facing a corporate termination or a hostile takeover. They were facing the absolute destruction of their entire existence, brick by brick. The golden child and her supposedly brilliant husband were about to lose their freedom, their assets, and their carefully cultivated social standing all at once. I instructed my specialized audit team to carefully compile the raw data into two entirely separate formats. The first format was a standard corporate review, prepared for our acquisitions committee to officially justify the hostile buyout on paper. The second format was a heavily detailed, legally binding criminal dossier, built to withstand any scrutiny. I was going to hand the chief financial officer his own personal death warrant, perfectly wrapped in the exact same arrogance he had always used against me, sealing his fate forever and for good. While my forensic team finalized the criminal dossier, the reality of the situation over at the target company rapidly deteriorated in real time. Lux Life was completely out of capital. Their vendors were halting shipments, and their corporate payroll accounts were dangerously close to overdrawing entirely. I monitored the daily cash flow reports bouncing across my glowing monitors, watching the exact moment the panic truly began to set in for the chief financial officer. Devon began aggressively hounding my proxy lawyer without pause. He called our external legal counsel 5 times a day, practically begging for the acquisition to close immediately. He offered massive, unprecedented concessions on the company valuation, one after another. He expressed a desperate willingness to sign over major corporate assets without any standard pushback whatsoever. It was the pathetic, frantic behavior of a man standing on a trapdoor with a rope wrapped tightly around his own neck. Devon was not trying to save the company for the sake of the loyal employees or the early investors who had trusted him. He was desperately trying to force our massive capital injection through the banking system to cover up the gaping crater of stolen funds he had personally created over the years. He desperately needed our buyout money to replenish the looted corporate treasury before the upcoming quarterly board meeting exposed his massive embezzlement for all to see. If the acquisition stalled for even one more week, his entire financial fraud would be laid bare for the primary venture capitalists to discover. He was running completely out of time and completely out of options. As a mandatory part of the standard corporate due diligence process, my firm legally acquired complete administrative access to all internal corporate communications at Lux Life. We needed to properly evaluate executive competency and internal day-to-day operations before formally assuming any financial liability on our end. I spent the entire weekend sitting alone in my quiet penthouse, systematically scrolling through the raw, unfiltered corporate email servers line by line. I specifically isolated the communication channels between the chief financial officer and the vice president of marketing, ignoring everything else. I read the frantic, completely unhinged messages Devin was sending to my sister behind closed, heavily guarded doors. The arrogant facade of their perfect, wealthy suburban marriage was entirely absent in these private digital exchanges, stripped bare. Devin was absolutely losing his mind with fear, message after message. I found an email sent at 2 o'clock in the morning, typed entirely in panicked capital letters. "Ashley, you need to stop spending company money right now," Devin wrote, his sheer terror radiating through the screen. "I cannot hide these corporate credit card charges anymore. The external auditors from the private equity firm are demanding itemized receipts anymore. The external auditors from the private equity firm are demanding itemized receipts for every single transaction we've made. If this pending acquisition does not go through by Friday, we lose the primary house. We lose the luxury boat. We lose absolutely everything we have built together. Do not buy another designer bag. Do not book another international flight. You are going to get us both completely ruined." I leaned back in my leather chair and smiled coldly, reading my sister's incredibly arrogant, dismissive reply moments later. She told him to stop being so hopelessly dramatic and to just do his job and fix the numbers like a real executive would. She fiercely reminded him that our parents were coming to visit the new vacation house this upcoming weekend, and she absolutely needed a new designer wardrobe for the planned family photos, no matter what he said. She was completely, hopelessly oblivious to the federal prison sentence hovering directly over her own husband's head. The sheer blinding ignorance of my family was, in that moment, an incredibly powerful weapon in my hands. They had spent their entire lives treating me like an incompetent, worthless servant, assuming I lacked the basic intelligence to understand their supposedly superior world. Now their complete inability to understand the catastrophic consequences of their own financial actions was handing me the ultimate, undeniable victory on a silver platter. I compiled the final executive review and called an immediate meeting with the Senior Acquisitions Committee at my firm. I presented the detailed financial models, deliberately omitting the separate criminal dossier I had carefully built against Devin behind the scenes. I outlined a ruthless, highly profitable restructuring plan for the entire lifestyle brand, step by step. I showed the senior committee exactly how we could acquire the struggling company for a mere fraction of its actual market value, immediately liquidate the bloated executive compensation packages, and turn a massive, unprecedented profit within 12 short months. The board of directors unanimously voted in my favor without a single objection raised. They granted me full, unrestricted executive authority to execute the hostile takeover entirely on my own terms. I walked back to my office and immediately authorized the massive transfer of funds. My firm officially purchased a 60% controlling interest in Lux Life that same afternoon. The ink quickly dried on the digital contracts, transferring absolute, undeniable executive power directly into my awaiting hands. I was no longer an invisible financial analyst or a discarded, unloved daughter cast aside like nothing. I was now, legally, the majority stakeholder of their entire corporate existence. I owned their employment contracts. I owned their inflated salaries. I owned their entire professional futures, every last piece of them. The intricate trap was now fully set, and the desperate prey had eagerly, willingly locked themselves inside it. I instructed my legal team to finalize the transition paperwork and prepare the termination protocols immediately. I wanted every single legal detail to be absolutely airtight, leaving no room whatsoever for negotiation or escape. The absolute power of the acquisition flowed through my veins, replacing years of bitter rejection with the cold, hard reality of total corporate dominance. I had successfully bought the very company that sustained their miserable, fraudulent lives. I looked out over the sprawling city skyline, visualizing the exact moment they would walk into my boardroom and realize the horrific truth waiting for them. They had sold their souls to the exact same girl they had thrown out into the rain 7 years ago, and I was fully prepared to collect my absolute due, in full, with interest. I meticulously organized the damning financial documents, placing the forensic audit securely inside a heavy leather binder. Everything was perfectly arranged for the upcoming executive meeting. The corporate execution of my extremely arrogant family members was finally about to begin the next morning, without mercy and without hesitation. I placed 2 empty folders on the polished glass surface of my desk that evening. The physical preparation of their destruction required absolute precision, down to the last detail. I picked up the first folder, a slim, dark blue binder. Inside, I placed the standard corporate termination documents for the Vice President of Marketing. I included a detailed separation agreement that explicitly denied any severance package, revoked all unvested equity shares, and immediately terminated her company health insurance effective that same day. I attached a formal demand for the immediate return of all corporate assets, including the company credit cards she had been using for years to fund her luxury shopping sprees. Ashley was going to walk into my boardroom expecting a massive retention bonus and walk out with absolutely nothing to show for it. I smoothed my hand over the blue cover, feeling a deep, quiet sense of satisfaction settle over me. This next one was not slim at all. It was a massive, heavy red binder containing over 300 pages of devastating forensic accounting data. This was the comprehensive criminal dossier I had meticulously built against the chief financial officer, page by damning page. I loaded the first section with the direct wire transfer receipts, linking Devon to the offshore shell companies. I filled the middle section with the falsified tax documents and the heavily manipulated quarterly earnings reports. The final section contained the completed referral forms for the Securities and Exchange Commission and the formal complaint already drafted for the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I had cross-referenced every single stolen dollar, down to the last cent. I placed the heavily encrypted flash drive containing the raw digital evidence into a plastic sleeve and secured it inside the front cover. This red binder was a fully loaded weapon, ready to fire. Devon was going to sit down expecting to negotiate his executive survival, completely unaware that he was looking directly at a guaranteed 10-year federal prison sentence. I aligned the blue folder and the red binder side by side on my desk. The traps were fully armed and ready to snap shut at any moment. I buzzed my executive assistant and instructed her to connect me to my external proxy lawyer without delay. I told him it was time to initiate the final phase of the acquisition protocol. I instructed him to formally invite the Lux Life executive team to our Manhattan headquarters for an emergency restructuring meeting first thing the next morning. I placed the phone on speaker and listened silently as he dialed the direct line of the chief financial officer. Devon answered on the second ring, his voice dripping with forced confidence and barely concealed panic underneath it. My proxy lawyer introduced himself and delivered the scripted message flawlessly, without a single hitch. He informed Devon that our private equity firm had officially secured the 60% controlling interest in the brand. He then stated that the new senior controlling partner required the immediate presence of the executive team the following morning to discuss the financial transition and sign the final restructuring agreements. I listened to the sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line, unmistakable even through the speaker. Devin tried to mask his massive relief, but his voice cracked slightly as he responded anyway. He eagerly accepted the invitation, assuring the lawyer that he and the vice president of marketing would be on the first morning flight to New York without fail. Devin actually had the audacity to suggest that he and the new senior partner would likely find a lot of common ground regarding the future vision of the company, as if this were a partnership between equals. He boasted that he had already prepared a presentation to highlight his own strategic value to the new ownership group. I sat in my quiet office and smiled coldly at his staggering arrogance, shaking my head slightly. He genuinely thought he was walking into a victory lap. He truly believed he had successfully conned another group of wealthy corporate investors, just like all the times before. My proxy lawyer agreed to the time, ended the call, and confirmed the targets were officially in motion, right on schedule. That evening, I walked into my expansive closet to select my armor for the upcoming execution. I bypassed the standard business attire entirely and reached instead for a pristine, incredibly sharp tailored suit I had commissioned from an exclusive Italian designer in the city. The charcoal gray wool blend had cost exactly $4,000. It was cut with aggressive, clean lines that projected absolute, unyielding authority from every angle. I laid the suit out perfectly, pairing it with a crisp silk blouse and a pair of formidable black leather stilettos. Every single element of the outfit was chosen deliberately to completely dominate the physical space of the boardroom the moment I walked in. I wanted them to feel the crushing weight of my financial power the exact second they laid eyes on me. I wanted their inherent superiority complex to shatter instantly, without warning. I dressed slowly the next morning, securing every button and adjusting the sharp lapels of the jacket with care. I walked over to the massive floor-to-ceiling mirror in my bedroom and stared directly at my own reflection for a long moment. I looked at the sleek, powerful senior partner staring back at me from the glass. My mind immediately flashed back to a vivid memory from 7 years ago. I saw the terrified, soaking wet 27-year-old girl standing in a cheap, ruined discount store blazer, shaking uncontrollably. I remembered the freezing rain soaking through my clothes as I ran desperately through the flooded streets of the city that morning. I remembered the crushing weight of the diaper bag my sister had carelessly dropped at my feet. I remembered the sound of my father laughing as he told me I did not deserve a life of my own. I remembered the cold, malicious glare of my mother as she blocked the door and tried to destroy my only real chance at a future. I looked back at the reflection of the woman standing in the $4,000 suit before me. I raised my chin slightly. The scared, vulnerable girl who let her family dictate her entire worth was completely gone now, erased for good. She had died in the freezing rain 7 years ago, and she was never coming back. The woman standing in the mirror was the corporate Grim Reaper, and she was finally, completely ready to collect her due. I grabbed my briefcase, locked the penthouse door behind me, and stepped into the private elevator to begin the final phase of my revenge. I arrived at the headquarters exactly 1 hour before the scheduled meeting, giving myself plenty of time to settle in. The executive suite on the 40th floor was completely silent, operating with the hushed efficiency of a serious financial institution. I walked past the reception desk, giving a brief nod to my assistant, and stepped directly into the primary glass-walled boardroom without pausing. The space was massive, deliberately designed to intimidate and overwhelm visiting corporate executives from the moment they entered. A long, flawlessly polished mahogany table dominated the center of the expansive room, surrounded by ergonomic black leather chairs positioned with precision. I placed my heavy briefcase on the smooth surface and carefully extracted the 2 critical folders. I set the slim blue folder and the incredibly thick red binder perfectly parallel at the head of the table, exactly where they needed to be. I sat down in the high-backed executive chair, feeling the cool leather press against my sharp-tailored jacket. I spun the chair slowly, turning my back entirely to the heavy double doors of the entrance behind me. I faced the massive floor-to-ceiling windows instead, looking out over the sprawling, waking city of Manhattan below. The bright morning sun reflected sharply off the surrounding skyscrapers, casting sharp, angular shadows across the boardroom floor. I sat perfectly still, listening to the faint, steady hum of the climate control system cycling quietly around me. My breathing was incredibly slow and perfectly measured, controlled down to the last breath. I mentally reviewed every single financial metric, every hidden fraudulent transaction, and every strict termination clause one final time. I was a dominant predator, waiting patiently in the absolute silence of my own specialized domain. The intricate trap was set perfectly, and the targets were currently riding the elevator straight up toward their ultimate, inescapable destruction. At exactly 9 o'clock, the heavy mahogany doors swung open loudly, breaking the silence. I heard the distinct, sharp click of expensive high heels stepping proudly onto the polished hardwood floor, accompanied immediately by the heavy, confident stride of custom leather loafers right behind them. My proxy lawyer entered first, his deep voice booming confidently across the expansive room as he formally introduced the executive team of Lux Life to the new controlling senior partner. I remained firmly facing the window, my back completely turned to the room, unmoving. I listened closely as Ashley and Devin walked further inside the boardroom without hesitating for a single second. Their footsteps echoed with staggering, completely unearned confidence. I could practically feel the overwhelming arrogance radiating off of them both from across the room. They were completely convinced they had just secured a massive financial bailout from some faceless, gullible corporate entity. I heard Ashley laugh, a high-pitched, heavily manufactured sound, deliberately designed to project casual charm. She immediately began complimenting the stunning view and the luxurious decor, desperately attempting to flatter whoever was sitting quietly in the high-backed chair with her back to them. Devin spoke next, his tone dripping with the arrogant, aggressive swagger of a chief financial officer who genuinely believed he was the absolute smartest person in the entire building. He loudly directed his wife to sit near the center of the table, positioning himself aggressively to dominate the upcoming negotiation from the start. I heard the distinct rustle of expensive fabric as they settled comfortably into their seats behind me. They were undoubtedly wearing their absolute most extravagant designer clothes, armed with luxury watches and tailored silhouettes, completely oblivious to the fact that their wealthy facade was built entirely on stolen venture capital. They sat there comfortably, adjusting their fraudulent corporate armor, fully expecting me to turn around and shower them with unearned venture capital and endless corporate praise. My proxy lawyer cleared his throat loudly, officially signaling that the guests were properly seated and completely ready to begin the final financial transition briefing. The massive room fell into a heavy, highly expectant silence. Devin impatiently tapped his expensive gold pen against the mahogany table, creating a sharp, highly demanding rhythm that aggressively requested my immediate, undivided attention. I placed my hands firmly on the smooth armrests of my leather chair. I did not rush the moment at all, savoring every second of it. I executed the movement with incredibly cold, highly deliberate precision. I slowly swiveled my chair around to face the exact center of the long table. The quiet, mechanical glide of the chair was the absolute only sound heard in the massive, tension-filled boardroom. I brought my hands up slowly, folding them perfectly over the blue and red folders resting ominously in front of me. I raised my chin slightly and locked my eyes directly onto the two stunned executives sitting across from me. I held their panicked gaze with the freezing, undeniable authority of a senior corporate partner who legally owned their entire professional lives now. The sheer power of the silence was completely deafening as the horrible truth finally began to register in their minds, one agonizing second at a time. The visceral reaction was instantaneous and absolutely devastating to watch unfold in real time. Ashley froze completely solid in her seat. Her manicured hands stopped moving midair, suspended. The highly confident, heavily practiced corporate smile shattered instantly, wiped entirely from her face in a single second. The color drained entirely from her skin, leaving her looking exactly like a terrified, hollow ghost. Her eyes widened in sheer horror as her brain violently struggled to process the mathematically impossible reality sitting calmly right in front of her. She opened her mouth to speak, but absolutely no sound came out at all. She just stared at me, completely paralyzed by the sudden catastrophic collapse of her entire heavily fabricated universe. Devin reacted very differently from his wife. He looked deeply confused at first, his highly arrogant, practiced smirk faltering sharply as he failed to recognize me immediately. He glanced over at Ashley, directly observing her absolute, paralyzing panic, and then looked right back at me, searching for an explanation. His deep confusion rapidly morphed into a burning, highly defensive anger. His face flushed bright red as his massive ego violently rejected the undeniable reality unfolding in front of him. He gripped the edge of the polished mahogany table, his knuckles turning completely white, utterly unable to properly comprehend how the pathetic, permanently discarded sister had somehow, miraculously, become the undisputed apex predator holding the final keys to his entirely fraudulent corporate kingdom. The heavy silence stretched across the expansive boardroom for several excruciating seconds, unbroken. Ashley desperately fought to regain control of her shattered reality. Her survival mechanism immediately defaulted to the exact same aggressive entitlement she had utilized her entire life, without fail. She refused, flatly, to accept the visual evidence sitting directly in front of her. She forced a harsh, incredibly brittle laugh that echoed sharply off the glass walls of the room. She practically threw her expensive designer bag onto the polished mahogany table and glared at me with absolute contempt. "Samantha, what are you doing here?" she demanded, her voice shrill and dripping with heavy condescension. "Did Dad finally get you a job as a secretary in this building? I knew you were struggling, but this is honestly pathetic. We are in the middle of highly classified corporate business. Go fetch us some coffee. We are waiting for the senior partner to arrive and evaluate our company." She actually waved her manicured hand in the air, physically shooing me away like a bothersome insect that had wandered into the wrong room. She desperately needed to believe I was merely administrative staff, nothing more. She needed the familiar dynamic of me serving her to anchor her rapidly collapsing sense of reality. Devin immediately caught his wife's defensive rhythm and eagerly latched onto the absurd narrative she had just constructed to protect his own massive, incredibly fragile ego. He shifted his broad shoulders confidently and leaned back into the expensive leather chair. He arrogantly adjusted the heavy, diamond-encrusted Rolex resting on his left wrist. He projected the absolute swagger of a wealthy chief financial officer who still believed, even now, that he controlled the entire financial universe around him. "Still running errands, little sister?" Devin sneered, flashing a highly manufactured, patronizing smile in my direction. "You heard your sister. Go tell your boss the chief financial officer of Lux Life is incredibly busy today and simply does not have the time to wait around for late executives. We have a multi-million-dollar acquisition to close. Be a good girl and bring us sparkling water while we wait for the real professionals to enter the room." Their sheer, unfiltered arrogance was absolutely breathtaking to witness. They were literally sitting inside a corporate slaughterhouse, utterly surrounded by their own massive financial crimes, and their very first instinct was to brutally degrade the only person in the room holding a loaded weapon. 7 years ago, those exact same degrading words would have completely crushed my spirit without a fight. 7 years ago, I would have lowered my eyes, apologized for my mere existence, and quietly walked out of the room to fetch their drinks like an obedient servant. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice. I did not show a single ounce of emotional weakness. I remained perfectly seated in my high-backed leather chair, my posture absolutely rigid and commanding. I looked at the two pathetic, deeply compromised individuals sitting across from me, and I felt nothing but cold, clinical detachment. I was simply observing two severely damaged financial assets, ready for immediate liquidation. I reached forward with slow, highly deliberate precision. I extended my right index finger and firmly pressed the glowing silver button on the brushed metal intercom system integrated directly into my desk console. The sharp beep echoed clearly through the massive boardroom. "Security," I stated, my voice echoing with freezing, undeniable authority. "Lock down the executive elevators immediately. Disable all stairwell access badges. No one leaves this floor under any circumstances without my direct, explicit authorization." A crisp, highly professional voice immediately responded through the intercom speaker. "Copy that. The entire floor is fully locked down." Ashley stopped breathing. Her arrogant smirk vanished instantly. Devin dropped his hands from the table, his posture stiffening as the heavy reality of the security lockdown crashed over him. He looked wildly at the heavy mahogany doors, realizing they were now trapped inside the glass walls of my designated territory. I calmly lifted my hands from the table. I picked up the master corporate acquisition contract from the pristine surface of my desk. The document was thick-bound in heavy legal paper and prominently featured the official corporate seal of my highly exclusive private equity firm. I placed my manicured fingers on the binding and smoothly, forcefully slid the massive legal document directly across the polished mahogany table. The heavy paper coasted flawlessly across the wood, stopping precisely an inch away from Devin and his expensive watch. I leaned forward slightly, resting my elbows on the table, closing the physical distance between us. I locked my eyes directly onto Devin, ensuring he felt the crushing weight of my absolute corporate dominance. "I am the senior partner," I declared, my voice echoing with terrifying, lethal clarity. "I do not fetch coffee, Devin. I fetch corrupted corporations. And as of 8 o'clock this morning, my firm officially executed the hostile buyout protocol. I own 60% of your company." I watched the exact moment their entire fraudulent universe completely imploded. The profound, overwhelming shock violently struck them both at the same time. Ashley physically recoiled, her back slamming hard against her leather chair, as if she had just been struck by a speeding vehicle. She stared blindly at the massive acquisition contract resting ominously on the table. The words printed on the cover page burned straight into her retinas. Devin began to sweat. Small, rapid beads of perspiration formed along his hairline. He instinctively reached for the thick contract, his hands trembling visibly. He flipped open the heavy cover page, his eyes desperately scanning the legally binding signatures and the massive financial figures. He read my name prominently listed as the sole controlling executive authority over his entire brand. They had spent their entire lives treating me like garbage. They had built an entire false reality where they reigned supreme, while I supposedly rotted in absolute poverty. Now they were legally bound to the exact woman they had tried to destroy. I owned their salaries. I owned their employment contracts. I owned their entire pathetic lifestyle. I sat quietly and watched them completely drown in their own magnificent, utterly inescapable corporate panic. Ashley stared at the crisp white pages of the master acquisition contract. Her eyes darted wildly across the legal terminology, desperately searching for a loophole or a typographical error that could explain away the absolute nightmare sitting before her. She refused to accept her sudden, complete loss of power. She forced another laugh, a jagged, breathless sound that scraped unpleasantly against the heavy silence of the boardroom. Her hands, adorned with expensive diamond rings purchased with stolen venture capital, were shaking so violently that the heavy legal paper rattled against the mahogany table. "This is some kind of elaborate prank," Ashley stammered, her voice pitching an octave higher than normal. "You probably hired a fake lawyer and rented this boardroom just to scare us. Mom and Dad always said you were completely delusional, Samantha. You are literally psychotic. You do not own a private equity firm. You cannot possibly afford to buy Lux Life." I did not entertain her desperate, pathetic delusions for even a second. I simply tapped my index finger against the polished wood of the table, drawing her frantic gaze back to the thick document. "Read the third page, Ashley," I instructed, my voice entirely stripped of emotion. "Read the notarized signatures of the institutional investors. Look at the federal tax identification numbers. Look at the authorized corporate seal of my firm. This is not a prank. This is a legally binding hostile takeover, and you are currently sitting in my building." Devin remained completely silent beside her. He had already read the signatures. As a chief financial officer, despite his massive corruption, he still recognized an authentic federal acquisition document the second he saw one. He knew the paperwork was entirely legitimate. Ashley turned to him, searching his face for reassurance, but she found absolutely nothing there. Devin stared blankly at the table, completely paralyzed by fear. The reality finally crashed through her thick wall of entitlement. Her breathing became rapid and shallow. The golden child was finally experiencing real consequences for the very first time in her life. I reached forward and picked up the slim blue folder resting on my desk. I opened it slowly, deliberately, letting the suspense suffocate the room. I extracted the comprehensive expense reports I had meticulously analyzed over the weekend and placed them directly in front of Ashley. I watched her swallow hard as she recognized her own fraudulent divisional budgets printed on the glossy paper. "Let us talk about your professional performance, Vice President of Marketing," I began, my tone razor-sharp. "I have spent the last 48 hours conducting a forensic analysis of your departmental expenditures. Your complete lack of basic financial literacy is genuinely astounding. You treated millions of dollars of investor capital like a limitless personal allowance." I slid the first highlighted page toward her shaking hands. "You submitted a massive expense report last quarter, detailing a comprehensive digital advertising campaign designed to target European consumer markets," I stated, reading directly from the audit. "You requested and received $200,000 for targeted social media acquisitions." Ashley opened her mouth to defend herself, but I immediately cut her off. "You didn't spend $200,000 on an ad campaign, Ashley. You spent it on a private jet to Mykonos and billed it to the company." I placed the flight manifests and the luxury villa receipts directly on top of her fake marketing report. "You flew yourself and 6 of your suburban friends to Greece for a 2-week luxury vacation. You expensed the champagne, the private chefs, and the yacht rentals. You categorized the entire trip as influencer outreach." I pulled out the next page without giving her a single second to recover. "And then, there is the Manhattan shopping spree," I continued relentlessly. $50,000 spent at a high-end jewelry boutique. You expensed diamond tennis bracelets and gold necklaces, claiming they were essential expenditures for brand marketing and corporate aesthetic development. You literally bought yourself diamonds using the operational budget of a failing lifestyle brand. Your entire department has a customer acquisition cost that defies basic economic logic. You have generated absolutely zero legitimate revenue for this company in 36 months. You are not a marketing executive. You are a corporate parasite draining the lifeblood of a distressed asset." Ashley completely broke down. The sheer terror of being exposed stripped away her arrogant facade entirely. Tears streamed down her face, ruining her perfect, expensive makeup. She looked at Devon for help, but he was physically shrinking into his chair, trying to make himself invisible to avoid the incoming fire. Realizing she was completely alone, she resorted to the only manipulative tactic she had left. She desperately tried to play the family card. "Samantha, please," Ashley cried, her voice cracking as she leaned forward across the mahogany table. "You cannot do this to me. I have a lifestyle to maintain. I have a public image. What will Mom and Dad say if you destroy my career? We are blood. You can't do this to me. I'm your sister." She reached her shaking hand out, attempting to grasp my arm in a pathetic display of manufactured sisterly affection. I smoothly pulled my arm back, completely rejecting her touch. I looked at the woman who had dropped a diaper bag at my feet and ordered me not to ruin her weekend. I looked at the golden child who had happily watched my parents throw me onto the street in the freezing rain. I felt absolutely zero empathy. I felt only the cold, satisfying weight of absolute justice. I watched her tears fall heavily onto the wooden table, waiting for the exact right moment to deliver the final crushing blow. The power dynamic had fundamentally shifted, placing me firmly at the top of the hierarchy. I took a slow, steady breath, cementing my victory. "I don't have a sister," I replied, my voice echoing perfectly cold and unyielding through the massive glass boardroom. "I have a grossly incompetent employee who just committed corporate theft. You're fired, effective immediately, without severance." Ashley let out a sharp gasp, collapsing forward onto the mahogany table as the reality of her termination crushed her completely. She buried her tear-streaked face in her hands, her shoulders heaving with violent sobs. Seeing his wife shattered finally spurred Devon into action. He pushed his chair back, the leather scraping loudly against the hardwood floor. He stood up, puffing out his chest and aggressively straightening his silk tie. He desperately attempted to project the commanding, unassailable authority he always used to intimidate my parents back in our suburban dining room. He slammed his palms flat onto the table and leaned toward me, his face twisting into a mask of pure defiance. "You cannot fire us," Devon demanded, his voice booming with forced bravado. "I am the chief financial officer of this brand. I am the only reason this entire operation is still breathing. I built the financial infrastructure from the ground up. I control the books. If I walk out that door right now, this company sinks into absolute oblivion." I did not even blink at his loud, theatrical display of corporate dominance. I slowly shifted my gaze from my sobbing sister directly to her arrogant husband. I reached out and placed both hands firmly on the massive, heavy red binder resting on the table. The silence in the boardroom grew incredibly heavy as I gripped the cover. "You do not control the books, Devon," I stated, my voice slicing through the air with terrifying, icy precision. "You cook them." I flipped open the cover of the criminal dossier. I grabbed the first massive stack of forensic accounting reports and forcefully slid them across the long table. The glossy pages fanned out perfectly, coming to a halt directly beneath his rigid hands. "Look at the highlighted sections, Chief Financial Officer," I commanded. "Look at the brilliantly hidden corporate subsidiaries you thought no one would ever uncover. You established a network of 20 separate dummy limited liability companies registered in the Cayman Islands, Delaware, and Panama. Let us review the specific entities you used to launder stolen venture capital." I read directly from my executive summary. Apex Holdings, LLC, Vanguard Strategic Ventures, Oceanic Consulting Partners. You wired $4 million to Apex Holdings last November under the guise of an international software licensing acquisition. Except Apex Holdings does not produce software. It is an empty shell registered to a vacant post office box in Grand Cayman, which conveniently funnels cash directly into a private wealth trust bearing your exact social security number. Devon froze completely. The aggressive posture vanished from his body as his eyes locked onto the highlighted bank routing numbers printed clearly on the forensic documents. You authorized another $2 million transfer to Vanguard Strategic Ventures in February. I continued relentlessly, flipping to the next page of undeniable evidence. You categorized that transaction as a vendor payment for supply chain management. My external auditors traced that exact wire transfer. The funds moved from the corporate treasury, bounced through a secondary holding account in Delaware, and landed directly in your personal offshore checking account. 48 hours after that money cleared, you finalized the purchase of your luxury yacht. You paid in cash. You literally bought a boat using the payroll capital meant for your software engineering department. Your digital fingerprints are permanently burned into every single fraudulent transaction. You left a glaring, amateur trail of metadata connecting your corporate login credentials to every single unauthorized offshore wire transfer. You did not build a financial infrastructure. You built a sloppy, incredibly obvious embezzlement scheme. The profound realization of his absolute destruction hit Devin like a physical blow. He slowly lowered himself into his leather chair, his legs seemingly unable to support his own weight anymore. The arrogant, untouchable executive facade shattered into a million irreparable pieces right in front of my eyes. The diamond-encrusted Rolex suddenly looked ridiculous on his trembling wrist. Massive beads of cold sweat broke out across his forehead, shining under the bright boardroom lights. His skin lost all its color, turning a sickly pale shade of gray. He looked at the forensic evidence stacked before him and finally understood the catastrophic magnitude of his situation. He was not looking at a simple termination or a standard corporate lawsuit. He recognized the specific formatting of the documents I had provided. He realized that I was not just firing him. I had him dead to rights on massive federal charges. He was looking directly at an airtight, fully documented case of interstate wire fraud, severe tax evasion, and massive corporate embezzlement. Devin swallowed hard, his throat clicking audibly in the quiet room. He raised his shaking hands in a pathetic gesture of complete surrender. "Samantha, please," he begged, his voice dropping into a desperate, frantic whisper. "You do not understand the pressure I was under. The investors were demanding impossible growth metrics. I just needed to move some capital temporarily to keep the appearance of profitability. I was going to put the money back. I swear to you, I was going to replace every dollar once the next funding round cleared. Please, you have to listen to me. We are family. You cannot hand these files over to the authorities. It will completely ruin our lives. Just keep this in the family. We can fix the books together. I will do whatever you want. I will sign over my equity. I will walk away. Just please keep this strictly in the family." I sat perfectly still, observing the sheer panic radiating from his sweating face. I let his desperate plea hang in the air for a long, heavy moment. The man who had mocked my discount clothes and my humble career was now physically trembling, begging for my mercy. He was utterly broken, entirely consumed by the terrifying specter of federal prison. I looked at the weeping executive sitting directly across from me, realizing that all of his fake power had been built entirely on stolen money and desperate lies. I did not offer Devin a single word of comfort. I simply closed the heavy red binder and pulled the master acquisition contract back to my side of the table. "You have exactly 1 hour to clear out your desks," I stated, my voice echoing coldly in the massive boardroom. "I have instructed building security to escort you to your respective offices. You will pack only personal effects. Every digital device, corporate credit card, and physical key card remains on your desks. If either of you attempts to access a single corporate computer or delete a single email, I will authorize my legal team to have you detained by local law enforcement before you even reach the lobby. Get out of my sight." Ashley let out a loud, pathetic wail, stumbling backward as she pushed her chair away from the mahogany table. She clutched her expensive designer handbag against her chest like a physical shield, her pristine white trousers looking completely ridiculous against her shattered, tear-stained face. Devin did not try to argue anymore. The sheer, overwhelming reality of his federal crimes had completely paralyzed his massive ego. He stood up slowly, his legs trembling so violently that he had to brace his hands against the table just to maintain his balance. The arrogant, untouchable chief financial officer was nothing more than a terrified criminal walking toward his own execution. They turned and dragged themselves toward the heavy double doors, moving like broken shadows of the wealthy executives they had pretended to be just an hour earlier. Security guards were waiting precisely outside the glass walls, stepping forward immediately to flank them as they began their humiliating march toward the executive elevators. I watched them leave the boardroom, feeling an incredibly deep, profound sense of absolute vindication. I gathered my pristine blue and red folders, picked up my heavy leather briefcase, and walked calmly back to my corner office. I sat down in my high-backed chair and turned my attention to the large array of glowing security monitors mounted on the far wall. The feeds captured every angle of the corporate headquarters. I watched Ashley and Devin step off the elevator and stumble directly into the main reception lobby. Ashley completely collapsed into a plush waiting chair, dropping her face into her hands. Devin paced back and forth frantically, pulling at his silk tie, desperately trying to loosen it as if he were suddenly suffocating. I zoomed the camera feed directly onto Ashley. I watched her pull her phone from her designer bag with wildly shaking hands. I knew exactly who she was calling. The golden child was doing what she had always done her entire life whenever she faced the slightest inconvenience or actual consequence. She was calling her protectors. She was dialing Brenda and Thomas. I watched her press the phone to her ear, her face contorting into an ugly mask of pure panic and desperate victimization as she undoubtedly shrieked into the receiver. She was likely screaming that her cruel, jealous sister had somehow stolen her company and destroyed her perfect marriage. I could practically hear the high-pitched, frantic lies pouring from her mouth. She would completely omit the massive corporate embezzlement and the fraudulent offshore accounts. She would frame the entire hostile takeover as a malicious, unprovoked attack born from my supposed mental instability and deep-seated jealousy. I knew exactly what was going to happen next. Brenda and Thomas would drop absolutely everything to rescue their precious wealthy daughter and their fake genius son-in-law. They would rush to the city, fueled by massive, ignorant entitlement, fully believing they could simply bully me into compliance, just like they did 7 years ago. They thought they could use their parental authority to force me to reverse a multi-million-dollar private equity acquisition. I pressed the silver button on my intercom system, connecting directly to the main reception desk on the ground floor. When my parents arrive, I instructed the head of security, you will allow them to bypass the main lobby protocols. You will grant them direct access to my floor and send them straight to my office. Do not stop them. Let them walk right in. I released the intercom button and leaned back in my leather chair. I opened the top drawer of my desk and retrieved a small, highly advanced digital recording device. I placed it discreetly behind a heavy crystal paperweight, perfectly angled to capture every single sound in the room. I pressed the activation button, confirming the solid red light was blinking steadily. I was fully prepared to document every single threat, every massive manipulation, and every desperate attempt at extortion they were about to deploy against me. I smoothed the lapels of my $4,000 tailored suit and checked my reflection in the dark monitor screen. I was completely unbothered. I had built an impenetrable fortress of wealth, legal authority, and absolute corporate dominance. They were walking blindly into a highly fortified trap, armed with nothing but pathetic guilt trips and completely empty authority. I folded my hands perfectly together on the pristine glass surface of my desk and waited patiently for the incoming storm. I knew they would violently burst through those heavy mahogany doors, fully expecting to find the weak, terrified 27-year-old girl they had heartlessly thrown into the freezing rain 7 long years ago. Instead, they were about to immediately face the absolute corporate Grim Reaper. I kept my cold, unblinking eyes locked directly on the heavy oak doors, quietly watching the bright red seconds tick by slowly on my digital clock. The final family ambush was rapidly approaching, and I was holding absolutely all the necessary keys to initiate their total, undeniable financial destruction. My breathing remained perfectly calm and entirely measured as I eagerly anticipated their frantic, doomed arrival. Every single advantage was mine now, and they were utterly powerless to stop the inevitable, catastrophic collision finally heading their way. 45 minutes after I watched Ashley and Devin drag themselves out of my building in utter disgrace, the heavy silence of the executive floor was violently broken. I heard the commotion before I even saw them. The sharp, frantic shrieking of my mother echoed down the pristine marble corridor, completely shattering the quiet, professional atmosphere of the acquisitions department. She was loudly threatening to sue the receptionists, demanding immediate access to the senior partner suite. My father was right behind her, his heavy footsteps thudding aggressively against the floorboards as he barked orders at the security personnel, who were deliberately standing down just as I had instructed. They did not even bother knocking. The massive mahogany doors to my corner office were thrown violently open, slamming hard against the interior walls. Brenda and Thomas stormed into the room, their faces completely flushed with rage and manic entitlement. They looked exactly as I remembered them from that freezing, rain-soaked morning 7 years ago, deeply arrogant, entirely consumed by their own fabricated superiority, and completely oblivious to the actual reality of the situation unfolding around them. My father marched straight across the expensive Persian rug, his chest puffed out, fully expecting me to cower the exact second he entered my domain. My mother followed closely behind him, clutching her designer purse, her eyes darting frantically around the expansive luxury of my private suite, before finally locking onto my face with absolute venom. Thomas did not hesitate. He walked directly up to my desk, raised his right arm, and slammed his heavy fist violently down onto the pristine glass surface. The impact rattled my crystal paperweight, but I did not flinch. "Who the hell do you think you are?" he bellowed, his voice echoing loudly off the floor-to-ceiling windows. His face was twisted in absolute fury, entirely unable to process the fact that the daughter he discarded was now occupying a seat of immense corporate power. "Rehire your sister right now," he commanded, pointing a thick finger at my face. "You sign off on Devin's budget immediately. Do you hear me? You do not get to walk into their company and throw your weight around just because you managed to secure some low-level finance job. They are running a massive lifestyle brand, Samantha. Devin is an executive. You are going to reverse this ridiculous termination stunt right now, or I will personally call the primary investors of this firm and tell them exactly how unstable you are." He was actually trying to discipline me. He was standing in the very center of my multi-million-dollar corporate fortress, attempting to ground a 34-year-old senior partner as if I were a disobedient teenager who had just missed curfew. He genuinely believed that his parental authority somehow superseded federal acquisition laws and binding corporate contracts. He thought he could simply shout loud enough, and I would hand his fraudulent son-in-law the keys to the company vault. Brenda immediately stepped forward to reinforce his completely unhinged demands, perfectly executing her classic emotional manipulation tactics. She slammed her hands on the back of the guest chair, glaring at me with raw, unfiltered disgust. "We are your parents," she screamed, her voice shrill and desperate. "You owe us. We gave you everything, and this is how you repay our kindness, by trying to destroy your own flesh and blood out of pure, bitter spite." Ashley is completely devastated. Devin is terrified they will lose their home. Ashley's kids will starve because of your jealousy. You have always been so deeply envious of her success, Samantha. You could never stand the fact that she married a brilliant, successful man while you had absolutely nothing. You are deliberately trying to ruin her perfect life just to make yourself feel important. You will reinstate their executive compensation packages this instant, or you will regret the day you ever decided to cross this family. She gasped for air, her chest heaving with manufactured outrage, completely ignoring the massive red binder of criminal forensic evidence resting just inches away from her hands. They were entirely oblivious to the federal wire fraud and the offshore embezzlement that funded the very lifestyle they were violently defending. They only cared about protecting the golden child and maintaining their fragile, incredibly expensive illusion of suburban supremacy. I sat perfectly still, letting their desperate, pathetic screams fade into the quiet hum of the climate control system. I reached forward, picked up my small porcelain cup, and took a slow, deliberate sip of my dark espresso. The rich, bitter taste grounded me completely. I placed the cup back onto its saucer with a soft, precise click. I looked at the two sweating, screaming people standing across from me, and I felt absolutely no fear, no guilt, and no lingering childhood trauma. I just felt cold, undeniable power. 7 years ago, you told me I was dead to you because I went to a job interview. I reminded them calmly, my voice remaining perfectly flat and chillingly detached. You locked the front door. You tried to destroy my only chance at a career because you wanted a free babysitter for your precious daughter. You told me my only purpose was to serve Ashley. You threw my belongings into the freezing rain and told the entire family I had suffered a mental breakdown. You erased my existence from your lives completely. I leaned forward slightly, resting my forearms on the glass desk, locking my eyes directly onto my father. Now, you are standing in my building begging for my money. You are standing in the center of the empire I built with my own 2 hands, demanding that I finance the pathetic, completely fraudulent lives of the 2 worst executives in the entire state. You have no power here. Your authority is totally meaningless. You do not dictate terms to the senior partner who holds the majority stake of your company. Brenda realized her aggressive approach had entirely failed. The screaming immediately ceased as she shifted her strategy. Her features softened dramatically, morphing into a mask of profound, manufactured maternal sorrow. She brought her manicured hands to her face, squeezing her eyes shut until perfectly timed fake tears began to roll down her cheeks. She took a hesitant step toward my desk, holding her arms open as if attempting to embrace me through the glass. "Samantha, my sweet girl," she sobbed, her voice trembling with intense, calculated emotion. "You have it all wrong. We never wanted to abandon you. We saw how brilliant you were. We saw that you had this incredible, massive potential buried inside you. We only pushed you away to make you strong. We knew that if we gave you a comfortable life, you would never reach your absolute peak. We sacrificed our relationship with you just to force you to fly. See? It worked. Look at this magnificent office. Look at the immense power you hold today. You became a giant because we gave you the gift of hardship. Now you have enough money to save the family. You can finally take your rightful place as our savior." The sheer audacity of her historical revisionism was genuinely staggering. She was actively trying to rebrand years of emotional abuse, neglect, and financial abandonment as a visionary parenting strategy. She wanted me to believe that locking me out in the freezing rain was an act of profound maternal love. I did not move a single muscle. I looked at her fake tears and felt a wave of profound disgust settle over me. "You do not get to claim credit for the fire that burned you," I stated, my voice echoing with absolute finality. "You threw me away because I was an inconvenience to your perfect suburban narrative. You do not get to rebrand your cruelty as tough love just because the daughter you discarded suddenly holds the key to your bank accounts. Seeing that Brenda's emotional manipulation had spectacularly crashed and burned, my father instantly lost his temper again. Thomas could never handle a woman defying his authority, let alone his own daughter. He stepped in front of my mother, his face turning a dangerous shade of crimson. He decided to abandon all pretense of family unity and resort directly to pure, aggressive extortion. He slammed his hand against his thigh and leveled a furious glare at me. "Listen to me very carefully, you ungrateful little brat," Thomas snarled, completely dropping the loving father routine. "You are going to authorize the capital injection for Devon right this second. If you refuse, if you dare to ruin Devon and humiliate your sister, I will go directly to the press. I will call every major financial news outlet in this city. I will grant exclusive interviews telling everyone exactly who you really are. I will tell them you are a vindictive, highly unstable daughter who is actively using her corporate position to carry out a psychotic personal vendetta against her own innocent family. I will paint you as a completely unhinged executive who lost her mind and decided to destroy a promising startup out of pure, unadulterated jealousy. I will call your managing partners. I will call your board of directors. I will make sure everyone in the financial district knows you are a toxic liability. Your entire reputation will be completely annihilated before the market opens tomorrow morning. You will be stripped of your partnership, and you will be back on the street exactly where you belong. Now sign the authorization papers and fix this mess, or I will destroy your career." Thomas stood there breathing heavily, convinced he had just delivered the ultimate, inescapable checkmate. He believed he still held the power to destroy my life with a few well-placed lies. I slowly stood up from my high-backed leather chair. I smoothed the lapels of my tailored suit, towering over the mahogany desk. I did not shout. I did not show a single ounce of fear. I simply raised my right hand and pointed a perfectly manicured finger at the small, heavy crystal paperweight resting on the edge of my desk. Directly behind the crystal, a small red light blinked with a steady, rhythmic pulse. Then I raised my hand higher, pointing toward the upper right corner of the expansive ceiling, where a high-definition security camera was silently tracking every single movement in the room. "You really should have done your due diligence before kicking my door down, Thomas," I said, my voice dropping to a terrifying, icy whisper. "You just marched into a highly secure corporate facility and threatened to initiate a fraudulent smear campaign against a corporate executive unless I authorized a massive transfer of capital to a failing company. You are currently attempting to extort a senior partner of a multi-billion-dollar private equity firm to cover up massive federal wire fraud," I stated clearly, ensuring every single syllable was captured by the digital audio recorder. "I could have you arrested right now. I could call federal authorities and hand them the exact audio of you demanding I participate in a massive corporate cover-up. You genuinely believed your parental title granted you total immunity from federal extortion laws. You thought you could walk into my domain and bully me just like you did in your suburban living room." The absolute gravity of my words hit them simultaneously. Brenda dropped her hands from her face, her fake tears drying instantly. Thomas froze completely solid, his aggressive posture crumbling into absolute paralyzing shock. The horrifying realization that they had just documented their own criminal complicity finally washed over them. Their faces drained of all color. They stared at the blinking red light on my desk. They were totally trapped in their own malicious, legally catastrophic web of lies. They had handed me the perfect weapon to destroy their lives, and I smiled coldly. My parents remained completely frozen in absolute horror, staring blankly at the blinking red light of my recording device. They suddenly realized the sheer magnitude of their legal vulnerability. A slight movement caught my eye. Standing just outside the threshold in the executive reception area were Ashley and Devin. They had apparently refused to leave the building as instructed, choosing instead to cower behind my parents, hoping the family ambush would successfully reverse their terminations. I shifted my gaze away from my trembling parents and looked directly at my former brother-in-law. Devin was leaning heavily against the glass door frame, looking absolutely devastated. The arrogant swagger of the chief financial officer was entirely erased. He looked like a man walking to the gallows. I stepped out from behind my glass desk, walked slowly across the expansive Persian rug, and stopped just a few feet away from the doorway. I folded my arms across my tailored jacket and looked Devin up and down with clinical disgust. "I told you I wasn't just firing you, Devin," I stated, my voice slicing through the heavy tension of the room like a perfectly sharpened blade. He swallowed hard, clutching the door handle to keep his knees from buckling. He still clung to the desperate, pathetic hope that I would simply terminate his employment contract and allow him to walk away quietly into the corporate sector. He profoundly underestimated the absolute finality of my restructuring process. I did not just remove cancerous executives from my acquisitions. I entirely eradicated their ability to ever operate in the financial world again. I turned my attention to the heavy red binder still sitting perfectly aligned on my desk. I looked back at Devin, making sure he felt the full crushing weight of my next words. Exactly 1 hour ago, while you and my sister were crying in the downstairs lobby, my legal team officially submitted the unredacted forensic audit to the Securities and Exchange Commission and the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I revealed smoothly. I authorized the immediate release of every single piece of digital evidence we uncovered. They have the offshore routing numbers. They have the fraudulent tax filings. They have the exact timestamps of every unauthorized wire transfer you executed using investor capital. The federal authorities now possess a comprehensive, undeniable map of your entire embezzlement network. The stark reality of federal involvement hit the room like a physical shockwave. My parents turned around to look at Devin, their faces completely drained of color. They did not fully understand the complex financial terminology, but they absolutely understood the terrifying implication of the federal authorities being summoned. I took a slow, deliberate step closer to Devin, making sure he heard every single word perfectly. "The feds are currently freezing your bank accounts, Devin," I continued, delivering the information with terrifying calm. "Every single dollar you siphoned into those Cayman Island shell companies is being locked down by federal warrants as we speak. Your domestic accounts are completely frozen. Your credit cards are heavily restricted. You cannot access a single cent of the money you stole to fund your fraudulent lifestyle. You are not going to a new job. You are not going to quietly resign and leverage your network. You are going to federal prison. You committed massive interstate wire fraud and aggressively defrauded institutional investors. The mandatory minimum sentencing guidelines for the sheer magnitude of your financial crimes guarantee you will be locked in a federal penitentiary for at least 10 years." The final shred of Devin's manufactured reality shattered completely. His legs gave out entirely. He collapsed backward into a plush waiting chair located in the reception area, his broad shoulders slouching in absolute defeat. He buried his face in his shaking hands, letting out a hollow, agonizing groan that echoed miserably through the pristine corporate corridor. The custom-tailored suit he wore suddenly looked like a pathetic costume on a completely broken man. He was no longer the arrogant, wealthy executive who mocked my discount clothes at suburban family dinners. He was a ruined, terrified criminal facing the absolute destruction of his freedom and his future. Ashley stood next to him, utterly paralyzed by the devastating revelation. For 36 years, she had lived entirely inside a perfectly crafted bubble of supreme entitlement. She had married a man she believed was a financial genius, a titan of industry who could provide her with an endless stream of luxury vacations, designer wardrobes, and elite social status. She had looked down on me my entire life, fully convinced that her opulent lifestyle was the ultimate proof of her undeniable superiority. Now the absolute truth of her existence was staring her right in the face. She finally realized that her husband's immense wealth was nothing but a criminal illusion. Her entire perfect life was heavily financed by stolen money. The expensive jewelry, the exotic trips, the massive suburban house, none of it actually belonged to them. It was all fraudulent, and it was all about to be violently seized by the federal government. Ashley turned her head slowly, looking down at her sobbing husband. The sheer horror on her face rapidly transformed into unhinged, explosive fury. She realized she was not just losing her job as a useless marketing executive, she was losing her entire identity. She screamed at him, her voice cracking with raw, unfiltered hysteria. "You lied to me!" she shrieked, swinging her expensive handbag and hitting his shoulder violently. "You told me you were a genius. You told me you were making millions from brilliant offshore investments. You promised me we were rich. You stole that money. You ruined my life. You are going to jail and leaving me with absolutely nothing. How am I supposed to pay for anything? How am I supposed to maintain my life?" She was completely unraveling, screaming at the top of her lungs in my reception area. She only cared that her fountain of stolen wealth had finally dried up. Her hands formed tight fists as she struck Devin on the shoulder again and again, demanding to know how he could possibly be so stupid. Devin did not try to defend himself. He just sat there, a broken shell of a man, staring blankly at the floor while his wife unleashed decades of spoiled entitlement directly onto his head. My parents watched this horrific spectacle unfold with absolute dread. The perfect suburban fantasy they had aggressively protected for 7 years was burning to the ground right in front of their eyes. Brenda could no longer handle the collapse of her golden child. She snapped. She pushed past my father and rushed back into my office, her face pale and slick with panicked sweat. She grabbed the edge of my glass desk, her knuckles turning white as she leaned over the surface. Her fake tears from earlier were entirely replaced by genuine, unadulterated terror. She abandoned the angry demands and the parental authority. She was practically hyperventilating, struggling to force the words out of her throat. "Samantha, you cannot let him go to jail!" Brenda screamed, her voice cracking into absolute hysterics. "You have to stop the federal investigators right now. You have to cancel the audit and give him the money. You do not understand what is happening here." I stared at her, unfazed by her frantic outburst. "I understand perfectly well that he committed federal wire fraud," I stated calmly. "He stole millions of dollars from institutional investors to buy designer handbags and luxury yachts for your favorite daughter. The authorities are handling it now. It is entirely out of my control." "No, you are not listening to me," Brenda wailed, tears streaming down her face and ruining her expensive makeup. "We took out a second mortgage on the family home to loan Devin $500,000 to cover his massive margin calls last month. We gave him the equity we had left. If he goes down and the company bankrupts, he cannot pay us back. If he does not pay us back immediately, we lose the house." The executive suite suddenly went dead quiet. Ashley stopped screaming at Devin in the lobby. She turned slowly, staring at her mother in total shock. Even Devin looked up, his face twisted in horror. Thomas stepped forward, his face turning dark purple with absolute humiliation and rage. He grabbed Brenda by the arm, trying to physically pull her back away from my desk. "Shut your mouth, Brenda," Thomas hissed through clenched teeth, desperately trying to silence his wife before she exposed their absolute financial ruin. "You do not tell her our private business. You do not tell her anything." But the damage was already done. The catastrophic secret was officially out in the open forever. I stood perfectly still, letting the sheer magnitude of their profound stupidity wash over me. My parents, The people who constantly mocked my discount clothes and my humble career beginnings had literally mortgaged the roof over their heads to bail out a fraudulent startup executive. They had willingly handed over $500,000 of their own equity to a man who was actively embezzling money, completely blinded by their desperate need to maintain their wealthy social image. They gambled their entire livelihood on the golden child and lost absolutely everything. I did not laugh. I did not gloat. A strange, clinical silence settled over my mind as my brain automatically processed the incredibly vital financial data Brenda had just practically handed to me on a silver platter. I stepped back from the edge of my desk. I turned my attention away from my frantic, terrified parents and looked directly at my high-resolution computer monitor. The glowing screen displayed multiple secure financial portals. I placed my hands on my keyboard and began to type with deliberate, calculated precision. I accessed our private equity firm's highly classified internal database, navigating straight to the distressed real estate and commercial debt acquisition portfolios. "Who holds the mortgage?" I asked, keeping my eyes locked firmly on the screen. "Which specific financial institution approved a $500,000 second mortgage for two retired adults based solely on a high-risk personal loan to a failing startup executive?" Thomas refused to answer. He stood rigidly, his jaw clenched, staring at me with pure hatred. He was drowning in his own catastrophic pride. But Brenda was completely unraveled. She was sobbing uncontrollably, utterly terrified of facing homelessness in her senior years. "Sterling Coastal Bank," Brenda blurted out, ignoring my father entirely. "We went through Sterling Coastal Bank." The loan officer was a friend from the country club. He pushed the paperwork through quickly because Devin promised a massive return on the investment within 30 days. He promised us we would make a fortune. I stopped typing. My fingers hovered perfectly still over the keys. I read the specific acquisition data displayed clearly on my private terminal. I looked at the exact dates, the transfer records, and the holding company authorizations. The universe possesses an incredibly ruthless sense of humor, and today, it was delivering absolute poetry. I slowly raised my head and looked directly at my father. "You mortgaged the house through Sterling Coastal Bank?" I asked, ensuring my tone was perfectly even. Thomas swallowed hard. The remaining fight drained out of his posture. He nodded desperately, a pathetic, silent confirmation of his ultimate financial failure. I looked at the two people who had thrown me into the freezing rain 7 years ago. I smiled the coldest smile of the entire narrative. "My firm bought Sterling Coastal Bank's distressed debt portfolio exactly 2 weeks ago," I announced, letting the absolute horror of the words settle into their bones. "Devin cannot pay you back. You completely defaulted, which means I technically own your house, and I am ordering the bank to proceed with the foreclosure." The sheer weight of that statement crashed into the room, obliterating the last remaining fragments of their false reality. Complete and utter devastation finally took its permanent hold. Ashley, the untouchable golden child who had spent her entire existence draped in unearned luxury, was now completely broke and entirely unemployable. Devin, the arrogant executive who had constantly mocked my hard work at every suburban dinner table, was staring down the barrel of a mandatory 10-year sentence in a federal penitentiary for massive corporate embezzlement and interstate wire fraud. And my parents, the deeply abusive architects of this entire toxic family dynamic, were officially losing the very home they had prized above their own daughter. They had literally handed the deed of their pristine suburban fortress directly to the exact same child they had so callously thrown out into the freezing rain 7 years ago. Thomas could not even form a coherent sentence. His mouth opened and closed silently, his face a terrifying shade of ashen gray. He clutched his chest, the reality of his severe financial ruin completely paralyzing his vocal cords. Brenda fell to her knees right there on my expensive Persian rug. She grabbed the edge of my mahogany desk, her fingers scrambling desperately against the smooth glass surface. She let out a loud, agonizing wail that echoed harshly against the modern architecture of my executive suite. She begged me to show mercy, pleading with me to reverse the banking orders and stop the federal investigators. She promised she would make Ashley apologize. She swore they would finally treat me like a real daughter if I just gave them back their stolen capital and their heavily mortgaged house. I did not offer a single word of comfort. I did not blink, and I did not break eye contact. I looked down at the woman begging on the floor and felt absolutely nothing but a cold, clinical sense of finality. I reached my right hand forward and firmly pressed the silver button on my intercom console. "Security," I stated, my voice projecting crisp and unyielding authority. "The unauthorized guests in my office are now trespassing on private corporate property. Please remove them from the executive floor immediately." Within seconds, the heavy mahogany doors swung wide open. 4 towering security guards entered the suite, their expressions perfectly neutral and highly professional. They moved with swift, coordinated precision. 2 guards approached Devin and Ashley in the reception area, gripping them firmly by the arms and guiding them aggressively toward the exit. Ashley screamed, digging the heels of her expensive designer shoes into the floorboards, completely ruining the leather as she desperately tried to fight the inevitable. Devin remained entirely limp, allowing the guards to drag his broken, terrified body down the hallway. The other 2 guards stepped into my office and grabbed my parents. Thomas tried to muster one last pathetic display of authority, shouting that he was my father and demanding respect. But the guard simply twisted his arms behind his back and forced him to walk. Brenda sobbed hysterically, reaching her hands out toward me as she was physically dragged backward across the room. She shrieked my name, crying out that I was destroying the family, crying that she would never forgive me for this absolute betrayal. I remained perfectly seated in my high-backed leather chair, entirely motionless. I watched the security personnel forcefully march my completely ruined family out of my office suite and down the long marble corridor. I did not turn away. I watched through the thick glass walls as they were shoved unceremoniously into the waiting executive elevator. Ashley was weeping uncontrollably, her perfect makeup running in dark streaks down her pale face. Devin was staring at his shaking hands, completely lost in his own federal nightmare. My father looked entirely defeated, staring blindly at the floor. My mother looked up and locked eyes with me one final time, just as the heavy metal doors began to slide shut. I held her panicked, desperate gaze until the elevator doors closed on them, forever sealing their catastrophic fate. The executive suite fell into a profound, immaculate silence. The toxic noise that had plagued my entire life was finally eradicated. I stood up from my desk, smoothing the sharp lines of my tailored charcoal suit. I walked slowly across the expansive room and stood quietly by the massive floor-to-ceiling windows. I looked out over the breathtaking expanse of the magnificent Manhattan skyline. The bright afternoon sun reflected brilliantly off the surrounding steel and glass towers, highlighting the immense corporate empire I now commanded with absolute authority. I took a deep, steadying breath, letting the crisp, conditioned air fill my lungs completely. I thought about the grueling 80-hour work weeks, the relentless financial audits, and the intense isolation I had endured to reach this exact pinnacle of power. I thought about the desperate, soaking wet girl who had run through the pouring rain with nothing but a cheap portfolio and a burning desire to survive. She possessed an absolutely unbreakable will that refused to accept defeat or surrender to their endless cruelty. That girl had built an indestructible fortress out of the very bricks her family had thrown at her. Blood does not make a family, I realized, speaking the words softly into the quiet, empty room. It just makes you related by absolute genetic coincidence. They tried to bury me to elevate themselves. They did not realize they were just digging their own deep and massive graves. Have you ever had to use your success to silence the people who said you would be nothing? Drop your story in the comments below. Hit that like button and subscribe. Remember, the best revenge isn't just living well. It's owning the ground they walk on. This marks the end of my journey, but the beautiful beginning of my absolute reign over the entire industry that gave me the power to conquer my demons and win forever. The story of Samantha brilliantly dismantles the deeply ingrained societal myth that we owe our biological families blind loyalty, regardless of how maliciously they treat us. The most profound and empowering lesson embedded within this narrative is that shared DNA does not equate to an unconditional license for emotional abuse, manipulation, or financial exploitation. For years, the protagonist was suffocated under the crushing weight of her parents' highly conditional love and her golden child sister's staggering entitlement. She was expected to sacrifice her own future, her literal ticket out of crushing debt and poverty, simply to maintain the superficial, fabricated image of her family's suburban perfection. However, her true liberation did not happen when she became a senior partner at a multi-million-dollar private equity firm. Nor did it happen when she legally seized her parents' foreclosed mortgage. Her ultimate defining victory began the exact second she stepped over that heavy diaper bag, walked out into the freezing rain, and chose herself. This powerful narrative teaches us that our inherent worth is never determined by those who actively try to keep us small. When we deliberately detach ourselves from the toxic, exhausting cycle of seeking validation from our abusers, we reclaim total control of our own destiny. Samantha channeled her profound pain and rejection into an untouchable armor of corporate dominance and absolute self-reliance. She proved that you do not need to accept the diminished role assigned to you by a dysfunctional family system. True family is forged through mutual respect, unwavering support, and genuine care, not through extortion and relentless control. Evaluate the relationships in your own life that constantly demand your sacrifice without ever offering